Before we begin, close your eyes if you'd like, or let them rest softly on whatever is nearby. You don't need to pay close attention. You don't need to remember any of this. Let the story just drift in like something you're hearing from the next room. Warm, familiar, a little funny, and full of things you never quite knew. Tonight, we're going behind the curtain of one of the strangest, wildest, most improbable shows in television history. A cartoon that was canceled not once, but twice. A show that was brought back from the dead by DVD sales and cable reruns in an era when that had literally never happened before. A show built by a 24-year-old kid from Connecticut who used to draw comic strips for his local newspaper, whose thesis film was handed to a television executive almost by accident, and who, within 3 years, had become one of the most powerful people in animated television. This is the story of Family Guy, but not the story you've seen played out in episodes. This is the story of what happened in the hallways, the recording booths, the writers' rooms, the Fox executive offices, and the moments of pure strange luck that had to fall exactly into place for any of it to exist at all. Get comfortable. Let your breathing slow. There's nowhere you need to be. Section 1. The Origins. A Boy, a Pencil, and a Dream. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on October 26, 1973, in the small town of Kent, Connecticut. Kent is the kind of place that people from small towns describe when they want to evoke the idea of smallness. A quiet New England community tucked into the Litchfield Hills, surrounded by covered bridges and old stone walls. The kind of town where the general store is also the post office, and everyone knows what everyone else had for breakfast. It was, by nearly every account, a peaceful place to grow up. Seth was the first child of Ronald Milton MacFarlane and Anne Perry MacFarlane, who were teachers. His sister, Rachel Ann MacFarlane, would eventually follow him into voice acting and find her own career in animation. But long before any of that, when Seth was just a small boy with thick-rimmed glasses and an almost alarming level of focus for his age, he started drawing. He was 2 years old the first time he picked up a pencil with real intention. Not just scribbling, drawing. His parents noticed early that their son had an unusual ability to observe something and then reproduce it on paper, to look at a cartoon character in a book or on the television screen and recreate it with an accuracy that didn't make sense for a child that young. By the time he was 5, he was drawing Woody Woodpecker from memory. By 6, he had moved on to Fred Flintstone. By 7, he was creating his own characters. When Seth was 8 years old, something remarkable happened. He began writing and illustrating his own comic strip. He called it Walter Crouton, a gentle parody of the famous television newsman Walter Cronkite, filtered through the imagination of a third grader who had apparently been watching a great deal of evening news alongside his cartoons. The strip was funny, surprisingly well constructed for a child his age, and it caught the attention of someone unexpected: the editor of his local newspaper, The Enterprise. The Enterprise was a small community newspaper, but it was a real newspaper, and they published Walter Crouton. Starting when Seth was 8 years old, his comic strip ran in the local paper every week. He was paid $5 per strip. Think about that for a moment. An 8-year-old boy in a small Connecticut town, drawing his comic strip every week, collecting his $5 payment, learning what it meant to have an audience, to create something and then release it into the world and have people respond to it. That early experience, that low-stakes but incredibly real feedback loop between creator and audience, would shape everything that came after. His parents were supportive in the particular way that thoughtful, education-minded parents can be. They didn't just tolerate his obsession with cartoons. They fed it. They took him to see Disney films, bought him books about animation, and crucially, they did not try to redirect him toward something more practical. When Seth told them he wanted to make cartoons for a living, they seemed to have taken him at his word. Throughout his school years in Kent, Seth continued to draw, continued to develop his comic sensibility, and began adding another skill to his repertoire: singing. He had an extraordinary voice from a young age, a clear, full, almost old-fashioned baritone that would have been perfectly at home in a 1940s radio broadcast. He loved the music of that era: the Great American Songbook, the standards, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Tony Bennett. While his classmates were listening to whatever was on the radio in the late 1980s, Seth MacFarlane was listening to music his grandparents might have danced to, and he was falling completely and genuinely in love with it. This is worth pausing on because it's easy to look at Family Guy, with its shock humor, its cutaway gags, its occasional vulgarity, and miss the fact that its creator is at his core a genuine lover of old Hollywood elegance. The tension between those two things, between the high-minded classical taste and the anarchic lowbrow comedy, runs through almost everything McFarlane has ever made. It's there in the show's musical numbers, in the way Peter Griffin occasionally breaks into a perfect crooning ballad, in the elaborate song and dance sequences that appear out of nowhere. The boy who listened to Sinatra never went away. He just learned to share a body with the boy who drew crude comic strips. After high school, Seth applied to the Rhode Island School of Design, known universally as RISD, pronounced RISD. RISD is one of the most prestigious art and design schools in the world, located in Providence, Rhode Island, and it was exactly the kind of institution that a boy like Seth MacFarlane needed. Rigorous, demanding, populated by people who took visual storytelling seriously as a craft, not a hobby. He enrolled in 1991 in the film, video, and animation program, and almost immediately he found his people. RISD's animation program was small and close-knit, and the students who went through it together tended to form bonds that lasted careers. One of the most important friendships Seth formed there was with a fellow student named Mike Henry. Henry was funny, warm, endlessly curious about comedy, and he was from a place that Seth had never been, Rhode Island. That friendship and Henry's familiarity with the particular culture of that small New England state would eventually become the seed of the show's setting. At RISD, Seth threw himself into his work with a level of intensity that his professors and classmates both admired and occasionally found slightly alarming. He was not a balanced student in the sense of maintaining careful boundaries between work and rest. He was the kind of student who stayed in the studio until 3 in the morning, who filled sketchbooks in the margins of his class notes, who watched classic animated films the way other students watched television, analytically, obsessively, taking them apart to see how they worked. His influences during this period were broad and specific. He loved the golden age of Hollywood animation, Warner Brothers cartoons, the Looney Tunes sensibility, the way Chuck Jones and Tex Avery could make a joke land through pure timing. He loved the anarchic comedy of Monty Python. He loved The Simpsons, which had premiered in December 1989, just 2 years before he arrived at RISD, and which had essentially invented the template for what an adult animated comedy could be. He absorbed all of it, synthesized it, and began finding a voice that was distinctly his own. His thesis project, begun in his final year, was a short animated film. He called it The Life of Larry. The film featured a middle-aged, not particularly bright man named Larry, his anthropomorphic dog Steve, and a general domestic sensibility that, if you squint at it, looks very much like the skeleton of something that would become enormously famous. Larry and Steve. A bumbling man and his slightly more intelligent dog companion, Larry's son. A general atmosphere of suburban absurdity layered over genuine human warmth. The Life of Larry was 11 minutes long. Seth animated it himself. He wrote it, directed it, composed elements of the soundtrack, and produced it under conditions that were, to put it mildly, not luxurious. RISD thesis projects are not made with Hollywood budgets. They are made with student loans, borrowed equipment, and time that was taken from sleep. But the film was good. It was noticeably, undeniably good. It had jokes that landed, it had a rhythm, it had a central character who was frustrating and lovable at the same time, a combination that is much harder to achieve than it sounds. Here is where the story gets interesting, and where the role of luck becomes impossible to ignore. Seth's thesis film, completed in 1995, somehow made its way to the desk of someone at Hanna-Barbera, the legendary animation studio responsible for The Flintstones, Yogi Bear, and 100 other icons of animated television. Accounts of exactly how this happened vary slightly. The version most often repeated is that one of Seth's professors at RISD, recognizing that the film was something special, took it upon himself to submit it to Hanna-Barbera without necessarily making a huge production out of it. The professor sent it. The studio watched it. The studio called. Seth MacFarlane was hired by Hanna-Barbera based on The Life of Larry. He was 22 years old. He had just graduated from art school in Rhode Island, and he was moving to Los Angeles to work for one of the most storied animation studios in the history of the medium. His early years at Hanna-Barbera were valuable in ways he probably didn't fully appreciate at the time. He worked as a writer and storyboard artist on several shows: Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, Dexter's Laboratory, and I Am Weasel. These were not prestige projects in the sense of being artistically groundbreaking, but they were extraordinarily useful training. He learned the mechanics of television animation production, the rhythms of writing for a weekly schedule, the way a joke reads differently on a storyboard than it does when it's voiced, the practical limitations and creative possibilities of the medium. And all the while, something was developing in the background. The characters from his RISD thesis film, Larry, Steve the dog, had not left him. He kept returning to them, kept finding new things to do with them, kept imagining a longer and more ambitious version of the world he'd sketched out in those 11 minutes. In 1996, he made a second short film, a follow-up to The Life of Larry, which he called simply Larry and Steve. This one was produced through Hanna-Barbera's What a Cartoon Showcase, a program that aired on Cartoon Network and was specifically designed to give animators a platform to develop new ideas. The What a Cartoon program had already served as the launchpad for several significant shows, and it was exactly the right venue for what Seth had in mind. Larry and Steve ran on Cartoon Network in 1996. It was short, but it was noticed. Not by millions of people. This was cable television in the mid-1990s, and these were 7-minute shorts in a showcase format. But it was noticed by the people who mattered, the development executives at Fox, who were constantly looking for the next animated hit in the post-Simpsons landscape. Fox had watched The Simpsons transform their network from a struggling fourth-place broadcaster into a cultural institution. They had seen what an adult animated comedy could do for a network's identity, its demographics, its ability to attract a young audience that everyone in advertising desperately wanted. They wanted another one. They had been looking for one for years. Someone at Fox watched Larry and Steve, and then they picked up the phone. The call that Seth MacFarlane received from Fox Broadcasting in 1996 or early 1997, accounts differ slightly on the precise timing, was the kind of call that happens in Hollywood legend, but rarely in real life. A major broadcast network wanted to meet with him about developing a show. Seth was 23 years old. He was still technically working at Hanna-Barbera, still learning his craft, still figuring out who he was as a creator. He took the meeting. The meeting went exceptionally well by all accounts. MacFarlane pitched with a clarity and a confidence that surprised the executives. He knew what he wanted the show to be. He had a sense of the characters, the world, the tone, the specific kind of comedy he was after. He was not pitching a vague idea and hoping the network would help him figure it out. He had a vision, and he could articulate it. Fox offered him a development deal. The terms, as they eventually shook out, were extraordinary for someone his age and experience level. A deal reported at around $2.5 million to develop the show. Some accounts put the figure somewhat differently, and the exact number has never been officially confirmed. But what is not in dispute is that the deal was very, very good for a 24-year-old kid from Kent, Connecticut. There is a story, one that Seth himself has told in various interviews over the years, about the night after he signed the Fox deal. He was, by his own account, not entirely sure what to do with himself. He had just received more money than he had ever imagined having. He was about to create a television show for one of the 4 major broadcast networks. He called his parents. He went home that night to his apartment, and by at least some accounts, he was so overwhelmed that he was unable to sleep. That apartment, incidentally, had a fuzzy door. The door to Seth's apartment at RYSD had been covered in some kind of fuzzy material. Accounts vary as to whether it was carpet, felt, or some other textile. And it became a minor landmark among the students who lived there. When Seth later formed his own production company, he named it Fuzzy Door Productions. The name is still there today, in the production credits at the end of every Family Guy episode. A small and permanent memorial to a college apartment, and a door that, for whatever reason, stuck in his memory. The Fox deal came with a deadline. Seth had to produce a pilot, a 7-minute pilot, a proof of concept, within a relatively short time frame. He went to work immediately, taking everything he had built across the life of Larry, Larry and Steve, transforming and deepening it, adding characters, building out the family, expanding the world from a concept sketch into something that felt fully inhabited. He worked on the pilot through late 1997 and into 1998. He worked with the kind of focused, slightly manic energy that would characterize the early years of the show itself. There were late nights, there was a lot of coffee, there was the particular anxiety that comes from knowing that you are making something that will either change your life or end the chapter before it's really begun. He was, throughout this process, also still relatively new to Los Angeles, still finding his footing in the industry, still building the network of collaborators and allies that a television show requires. He reconnected with his RISD friend Mike Henry, who had moved to the area and was pursuing his own career in entertainment. Henry's Rhode Island background, his comfort with the particular rhythms and culture of that small New England state, continued to influence the shape of the world Seth was building. The fictional town where the Griffin family would eventually live, that small coastal New England community, was drawn in part from the texture of the place Mike Henry had grown up. The pilot was completed. It ran approximately 7 minutes. Seth personally presented it to Fox executives in May of 1998. What happened next we will save for the next section of our story, because what happened next deserves its own slow telling. For now, just let that image settle in. A 24-year-old man walking into a room full of television executives with 7 minutes of animation he'd spent a year making, carrying in that small reel of film the entire future of something that would run for decades, influence a generation of comedy writers, survive 2 cancellations, sell millions of DVDs, and one day be talked about on a YouTube channel while you are trying to fall asleep. Everything that was about to happen started in that room. If you're enjoying this journey into the hidden history of Family Guy, drop a comment below. Let us know which behind-the-scenes fact has surprised you most so far. And if this is helping you drift off to sleep or just unwind, consider subscribing so you never miss a new narration. We put a lot of love into these, and it genuinely means the world to know you're here. Now, let's continue. Section 2. The Pilot That Almost Never Was. There is a particular kind of silence that falls in a conference room when everyone present knows they are watching something that might be very good or very bad, and they cannot quite tell which yet. It is the silence of suspended judgment, of people who have trained themselves to be skeptical, who have been in 1,000 meetings where someone walked in with something they believed in completely and it turned out to be nothing, sitting very still and trying to feel something true. That was probably the silence in the Fox conference room on May 15, 1998, when Seth MacFarlane showed his pilot. The pilot was called Death Has a Shadow, a title that sounds, on its face, much darker than the episode actually is. The episode follows a man named Peter Griffin, heavy-set, not terribly bright, endearing in a way that is specific to people who are confidently wrong about most things, who loses his job at a toy factory after being caught sleeping on the job. Rather than tell his wife, Lois, he applies for welfare and receives, due to some paperwork error the show never quite explains, a welfare check for $150,000 per week. Rather than report the error, Peter begins spending the money, eventually getting caught, going on trial, and nearly going to prison before the situation is resolved through a series of escalating implausibilities. None of which, in isolation, sounds remarkable. The plot of that first episode is not the point. The plot of almost any Family Guy episode is rarely the point. What the pilot was really doing was introducing a world, a family, a neighborhood, a rhythm of comedy, and establishing that this world was going to work in a specific way. Cutaway gags that departed entirely from the main story. Jokes that were offensive to some people and hilarious to others, and occasionally both at once. A talking baby with world domination ambitions and an inexplicable British accent. A dog who drank martinis and wrote bad novels. A father who was, depending on the moment, a figure of sweet pathos or breathtaking stupidity, and who moved between those two registers with a speed that took a few episodes to fully appreciate. The Fox executives watched the 7-minute pilot, and then, this is the part that surprises people when they first hear it, they ordered the show. Not a full pilot, not a development deal with options. They ordered the show. Family Guy was greenlit, essentially, from that 7-minute proof of concept, with a commitment for a full season of episodes. This almost never happens. The development process for a television show is, under normal circumstances, an extended exercise in caution and attrition. Networks commission scripts. Then they commission pilots. Then they test pilots with audiences. Then they debate internally for months. The process can take years, and it kills more ideas than it nurtures. The order Fox placed for Family Guy in 1998 skipped several of those steps almost entirely, which was either a sign of extraordinary confidence in what they'd seen, or a sign that someone very senior at Fox had a strong gut feeling and enough authority to act on it. The order was for 13 episodes. Production began almost immediately, and here is where the pressure began. Seth MacFarlane was 24 years old, soon to turn 25. He had never run a writer's room. He had never been a showrunner. He had worked as a writer and artist in animation, but the experience of overseeing a team of writers, managing voice talent, supervising animation, navigating the network relationship, handling post-production, and doing all of this on a broadcast television schedule, that was entirely new territory. He had to hire people. He had to build a writer's room from scratch, which means finding people who are not just funny individually, but funny in a way that is compatible with the voice and vision of the show. A writer's room is a social organism as much as a creative one. It has a culture, a temperature, and internal hierarchy that can make the work better or worse depending on how it's managed. Getting the wrong people in the room doesn't just produce bad jokes. It changes the atmosphere in ways that are hard to fix once they're established. Seth brought in writers whose backgrounds varied significantly. Some came from stand-up comedy. Some came from other animation projects. Some were friends from his own orbit, people whose sensibility he trusted and who trusted his. The early writer's room was a small operation. There were not dozens of staff writers jostling for position. It was closer in size and spirit to a garage band than to a full orchestra, which meant that the creative process was fast and somewhat chaotic, driven by the instincts of a handful of people who were all figuring it out together. The voice cast also had to be assembled. This is, in television animation, a process that can make or break a show before a single episode airs. The voice of a cartoon character is not just a performance. It is the character, in a way that is difficult to overstate. When a voice matches a character, the animation can be rough, the writing can occasionally slip, and the audience will still follow. When a voice doesn't quite fit, no amount of excellent animation or sharp writing will make it feel right. For Peter Griffin, the lead character, Seth had always intended to voice the role himself. He had been performing Peter's voice since the character's earliest incarnation as Larry, and the voice had evolved over years of private experimentation into something very specific. Thick Rhode Island accent, a nasal quality that suggested a man who had opinions about everything and the intellectual capacity to back up almost none of them. Seth could slip into it effortlessly. He performed it in the meeting with Fox executives, and they understood immediately that this was not going to be a case of finding someone to voice the lead. The voice already existed. Seth would also voice Brian Griffin, the family dog, whose voice was a conscious departure from Peter's. Smoother, more measured, with an air of faded sophistication. Seth has described Brian's voice as partly inspired by Cary Grant, the old Hollywood film actor. And when you listen for that influence, you can hear it. The careful diction, the slight precision of articulation, the sense of a man who considers himself more refined than his surroundings. Brian would become, over the course of the series, one of the most complex and discussed characters on the show. A figure of both comedy and pathos. A dog who wanted desperately to be taken seriously as a writer and thinker, and was consistently reminded that the world saw him differently. And then there was Stewie, Stuart Gilligan Griffin, the infant son of Peter and Lois, whose voice Seth would also perform. Stewie's voice is perhaps the most technically demanding of Seth's four main character performances. A theatrical, upper-class British accent layered over the physical reality of being a baby, producing a collision between the elegance of the voice and the absurdity of the context that is, at its best, one of the funniest things in animated television. Stewie, in the early seasons, was explicitly a villain, a genius infant with elaborate plans for world domination, and a murderous contempt for his mother. The character would evolve significantly over the years, becoming more of a comic figure and eventually, somewhat surprisingly, one of the show's emotional centers. But in the beginning, Stewie was pure anarchic darkness, and Seth's performance of him was absolutely committed to that darkness in a way that sold every joke. For Lois Griffin, Peter's wife, the audience surrogate in many ways, the character through whose exasperation we often experience the show's mayhem, Fox and Seth considered several candidates. The first actress to voice Lois was Carrie Fisher, of all people. Fisher recorded some lines for early development materials, and while her voice had a natural warmth and intelligence, the fit wasn't quite right. The role eventually went to Alex Borstein. Alex Borstein came from a background in sketch comedy, most notably from the television show MADV, where she had spent years developing a range of characters and voices and comedic instincts that made her enormously versatile. She was sharp, funny, and possessed of a voice for Lois that struck exactly the right balance. A woman who was fundamentally good and loving, who had given up something of her own life and potential to be a wife and mother, and who handled the resulting frustrations with varying degrees of dignity. Borstein brought warmth to Lois without making her saccharine, and brought edge to her without making her unsympathetic. It was and remains a beautifully calibrated performance. Seth Green, who by 1998 was already known to television audiences from his recurring role on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, was cast as Chris Griffin, the teenage son. Green's voice for Chris, a slightly goofy, earnest, good-natured young man who was not especially academically gifted, but whose emotional simplicity was often rendered as a kind of wisdom, was warm and immediate. Green has spoken in interviews about his affection for Chris as a character, and that affection comes through in the performance. The role of Meg Griffin, the eldest child and the family's designated scapegoat, a role that would only expand in its comedic darkness over the years, went through 2 casting changes before settling. Cree Summer, a celebrated voice actress with an enormous resume, recorded some lines for the role in the very early stages. Then the role went to Lacey Chabert, who at the time was a teenager known to audiences for her role on Party of Five. Chabert voiced Meg throughout the first season, and her name does not appear in the show's credits, a situation that reportedly related to the complex contractual landscape of her other commitments. When Season 2 came around, the role was recast. The actress who replaced Lacey Chabert as Meg Griffin was 15 years old. Her name was Mila Kunis. She had auditioned for the role and, by Seth MacFarlane's own account, was not obviously the right choice when the audition began. She sounded young, she sounded nervous, but she persisted through the audition, and something in the reading, some quality of teenage wounded dignity, of a girl who wanted desperately to be seen and consistently wasn't, caught the attention of the room. She got the part. Mila Kunis has now been playing Meg Griffin for more than 25 years. It is one of the longest-running voice acting relationships in American television history. The girl who was 15 and nervous in an audition room is now one of the most recognizable figures in Hollywood, and she still comes in every week when the show is in production and voices the Griffin family's least appreciated member. The role of Joe Swanson, Peter's wheelchair-using neighbor, the voice of frustrated physical capability, a man whose body had been broken but whose spirit was permanently coiled for action, went to Patrick Warburton. Warburton, physically imposing and possessed of a voice like controlled thunder, brought to Joe exactly the right quality. A man performing normalcy with enormous effort, whose eruptions of emotion were all the funnier for how carefully they were contained. Warburton's Joe became one of the show's most beloved supporting characters, and the character's catchphrase, a sudden explosive burst of frustrated energy, became one of the show's most quoted pieces of dialogue. Glenn Quagmire, the predatory but oddly lovable neighbor, was voiced by Seth himself, giving him a total of 4 main character performances in the show. And the roles of Cleveland Brown, the gentle, soft-spoken neighbor who would later get his own spin-off, and Herbert the elderly neighbor were voiced by Mike Henry, Seth's RISD friend, the Rhode Islander whose background had helped shape the show's setting. With the cast assembled and the writers' room staffed, production began in earnest. The schedule was demanding. Animation is always demanding, and it takes far longer to produce than live-action television, and the budget pressures are constant. But the team had something that is very hard to manufacture: genuine belief in what they were making. The premiere date was set for January 31st, 1999. And it was not just any premiere date. Fox had scheduled Family Guy to air directly after Super Bowl 33. Super Bowl Sunday is the single most watched television event in the United States. The game between the Denver Broncos and the Atlanta Falcons drew a national audience of more than 80 million viewers that year. After the Super Bowl, a significant number of those viewers stayed on Fox to watch whatever came next. What came next on that winter Sunday in 1999 was the first episode of Family Guy. Approximately 22 million people watched that premiere episode. 22 million people met Peter and Lois and Meg and Chris and Stewie and Brian for the first time, heard their voices, absorbed the rhythms of their world, encountered the cutaway gag structure that would become one of the show's defining signatures. The reviews that followed were mixed in interesting ways. Some critics admired the show's anarchic energy, its willingness to go places that primetime animation rarely went. Others found it derivative, too similar to The Simpsons in its broad outline, too reliant on shock value to cover gaps in its character development. The comparison to The Simpsons was something Seth and the writers would hear for years, and it stung in a particular way because it was not entirely unfair and yet also missed something essential about what Family Guy was doing. But those 22 million viewers were a number that made Fox very happy, and in television, a happy network is the most important thing in the early life of a show. The first season aired through the spring of 1999. The ratings held reasonably well. Not at Super Bowl levels, obviously, but at numbers that suggested an audience had found the show and was returning to it. There were bumps. There were episodes that worked better than others. There was the ongoing process of a show finding what it was, of writers and performers and animators learning the specific language of the world they were building together. But there was also something growing, a genuine connection with a specific kind of viewer. Family Guy was finding its audience. The question, as with all new shows, was whether the network would give it time enough to matter. That question, as we will eventually see, would be answered in the most complicated and surprising way possible. Section 3. The cast. Voices, secrets, and the people behind the characters. There is something quietly miraculous about the way a voice acting ensemble comes together on a long-running animated show. Unlike a live-action cast where the actors must physically inhabit a space together, must move through light and shadow in front of cameras, must negotiate the social reality of being in a room with one another day after day, a voice cast can, in theory, exist in almost complete isolation from each other. Each actor goes into the booth. They read their lines. They leave. The magic of making them seem like a family, like people who have known each other for decades, who can anticipate each other's rhythms and react in real time. All of that happens in the editing bay, in the writing room, in the imagination of the audience. And yet somehow, on Family Guy, the cast found a genuine warmth with one another that, according to everyone who has spent time on the production, was not manufactured and not performed. It was real. Seth MacFarlane has said in numerous interviews over the years that the recording sessions for Family Guy are among the most genuinely enjoyable parts of making the show. The cast, assembled over the first couple of seasons and then remarkably stable for the show's entire run, developed a chemistry that most productions would spend years trying to cultivate artificially. They made each other laugh. They found things in each other's performances that inspired new choices in their own. They built something together that is unusually rare in the specific isolation chamber of voice acting. Let's spend some time with the individual performers because their stories are interesting in themselves, separate from the show that brought them together. Alex Borstein, who voices Lois Griffin, had a path to the role that was not entirely straightforward. As mentioned, she came from MAD-TV, the sketch comedy show that ran on Fox and served as a kind of proving ground for comedic performers in the late 1990s and early 2000s. At MAD-TV, Borstein had developed a range of characters and voices, and her ability to find the inner life of a character through nothing but vocal choices was evident to anyone who worked with her. But Lois was something different from the sketch comedy characters she'd been playing. Lois required consistency, not the flash of a sketch, but the slow accumulation of a character over hundreds of episodes, the way a real person reveals themselves over time. Borstein has spoken about Lois as a character she has enormous affection for, precisely because Lois is not simple. Lois has secrets. Lois has a past, a wealthy upbringing, a life she gave up, desires that didn't entirely disappear when she became a wife and mother. In the early seasons especially, Borstein found notes in Lois that the writing sometimes only sketched an outline, filling them with warmth and frustration and occasional darkness that made the character feel fully inhabited. There is a story about Borstein that has circulated for years in entertainment journalism, which concerns not Family Guy specifically, but her general approach to her career. She is, by all accounts, someone who takes comedy seriously as a craft and as an intellectual endeavor, who thinks carefully about why things are funny and what it means to make people laugh. When The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel came along, the Amazon series in which she plays Susie Meyerson, the manager, it revealed to a new generation of viewers dimensions of her talent that even Family Guy fans might not have fully appreciated. But she never left Family Guy. She has been Lois Griffin for more than a quarter century, and the two careers have run in parallel, each informing the other in ways that she has described as mutually sustaining. Seth Green, who voices Chris Griffin, has a career in entertainment that is almost aggressively varied. He is an actor who has appeared in everything from Austin Powers films to the indie dramatic film Party Monster to nearly 7 seasons of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, where he played the lovable and complicated Daniel Osborne. He is also the creator and driving force behind Robot Chicken, the stop-motion sketch comedy series on Adult Swim that has been running since 2005 and has won multiple Emmy Awards. Green is, in the industry, considered a genuinely unusual figure, someone with both mainstream commercial instincts and genuinely experimental creative impulses, who has managed to maintain both simultaneously over a long career. Chris Griffin, the character he voices on Family Guy, is in some ways the inverse of Green's own public persona. Chris is sweet and straightforward, his comic role often that of the innocent who says the accidentally profound thing, or the character whose lack of guile creates situations that wiser people would have avoided. Green brings to Chris a quality of uncomplicated guilelessness that works beautifully against the show's general atmosphere of knowing cynicism. Chris's jokes land differently than anyone else's because they seem to come from a place of genuine sincerity, and that contrast is something that requires real skill to maintain over hundreds of episodes. Mila Kunis and her relationship with Meg Griffin deserves its own extended examination, partly because it is so long, and partly because the evolution of that relationship mirrors the show's own complicated history with the character. Kunis has been, by her own occasional statements on the subject, somewhat ambivalent about how Meg was written during the show's middle seasons. She has spoken publicly about attending fan conventions and events, and having strangers repeat to her Peter Griffin's dismissive line directed at Meg, essentially using the character's abuse as a way to interact with the woman who voiced her. This bled from fiction into reality in a way that Kunis has described as uncomfortable because the line between the character and the actress can, for some audiences, become blurrier than the actress would prefer. But she has also spoken about her genuine affection for the show, for the ensemble, and for the specific strange honor of having voiced a character who has appeared in over 400 episodes of American television. The girl who was 15 and nervous in an audition room in 1999 has now been playing Meg Griffin for longer than many people in the show's current audience have been alive. There is something in that continuity that Kunis seems to genuinely value, even while acknowledging that the character's treatment by the writing staff was not always something she was comfortable with. Patrick Warburton is a specific kind of performer. Tall, physically imposing, possessed of a voice that sounds like it was engineered in a laboratory to convey maximum masculine authority, who has built an entire career on the comedy of subverting those qualities. Joe Swanson on Family Guy, David Puddy on Seinfeld, Lemony Snicket in the Netflix adaptation of a series of unfortunate events, the voice of the Tick in both the animated and the live-action versions of that character. Warburton has spent decades playing men whose outer presentation suggests one thing, while their inner reality suggests something much funnier and more complicated. Joe Swanson in the early seasons was a genuine fan favorite, the cool, capable neighbor whose wheelchair did not diminish his authority or his toughness, who was admired rather than pitied, and whose friendship with Peter was one of the show's warmer relationships. The character's trajectory over the seasons has been a source of some fan frustration, as Joe was gradually written more and more as a figure of dysfunction and pity rather than capability and dignity. But Warburton's performance never changed its fundamental quality. He always plays Joe as a man who believes in himself, even when the writing is working against him, and that conviction carries the character through episodes that might otherwise reduce him to a punchline. Mike Henry, who voices Cleveland Brown and Herbert the elderly neighbor, is one of the production's quieter presences in the public consciousness, despite being one of its longest-serving collaborators. Henry was Seth's friend from RISD, the Rhode Islander whose background helped shape the setting of the show, and his involvement in Family Guy predates the show itself. He was in Seth's orbit when the earliest versions of the characters were being developed. His voice work on the show across more than 2 decades covers an enormous range, from Cleveland's gentle thoughtfulness to Herbert's unsettlingly cheerful creepiness. And both performances have become, in their very different ways, among the show's most recognizable. The Cleveland Brown spin-off, which ran from 2009 to 2013 on Fox, was an attempt to expand the Family Guy universe in the direction of one of its most beloved supporting characters. The show followed Cleveland after he relocated from the fictional New England town to Steuben, Virginia, and assembled a new family and a new set of neighbors. It ran for 4 seasons and was canceled in 2013. Henry continued to voice Cleveland on Family Guy after the spin-off ended, and Cleveland returned to his original neighborhood and his original place in the show's ensemble. The spin-off experiment, in retrospect, illuminated something about the specific chemistry of Family Guy's main cast. The characters work best in their original context, against each other, in the rhythm of relationships that had been built over years. There is one other voice worth mentioning, though the performer does not appear in a regular role. Carrie Fisher, the actress who provided some early vocal material for Lois Griffin before Alex Borstein took the role, was not entirely absent from Family Guy after that early development stage. She appeared in several episodes as a guest voice, including a recurring role as Peter's boss. Fisher was famously difficult to categorize as a performer. She was a movie star, a novelist, a memoirist, a script doctor who worked anonymously on films across decades, a mental health advocate, and a wit so sharp and so immediate that she was often the most interesting person in any room she occupied. Her guest appearances on Family Guy were brief, but they left the impression of someone who understood exactly what the show was doing and found it genuinely amusing. One element of the show's voice production that often surprises people is the extent to which the cast members have, over the years, occasionally been in the same room together for recording. Animation voice work is typically done individually. Actors record alone in the booth and their performances are assembled in post-production. But Family Guy, particularly in its earlier seasons, sometimes brought cast members together for table reads and even for some recording sessions where the energy of having people actually respond to each other in real time could be captured. The difference in the performances, the slightly more spontaneous quality that comes when an actor can hear someone else's timing and react to it, is sometimes audible in the episodes themselves, if you know to listen for it. Seth's own recording sessions are, by several accounts from people who have been present for them, remarkable for their speed and precision. He can shift between Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire with an ease that makes the transitions seem almost physiological rather than performed, as if each voice lives in a different part of his instrument and he is simply redirecting the airflow. Directors and audio engineers who have worked with him describe the sessions as efficient to a degree that is unusual in voice recording, where the standard expectation is that multiple takes and significant time will be required to land a performance. Seth generally arrives knowing what he wants to do and then does it, with adjustments coming quickly and without apparent effort. This is not to say that the process has been without moments of creative disagreement or friction. Any collaboration that lasts 25 years will accumulate its share of tensions, compromises, and moments where different visions for a character or a scene come into conflict. But the specific friction that drives Family Guy's vocal ensemble seems to have been generative rather than destructive, the kind of disagreement that sharpens work rather than sours relationships. The ensemble has remained, with only the early cast changes for Meg, remarkably stable for the entire run of the series. In an industry where cast turnover is common, where contracts expire and relationships deteriorate and people move on to other projects and aren't replaced so much as written around, Family Guy's voice cast has stayed together with a consistency that is genuinely unusual. The original ensemble that first voiced Peter and Lois and Chris and Meg and Stewie and Brian and Joe and Quagmire back in 1999 is, with one exception, the same ensemble voicing those characters today. That exception, of course, is Cleveland. In 2020, following a national reckoning with issues of racial representation in media, Mike Henry, who who is white, announced that he would no longer voice the character of Cleveland Brown, who is black. Henry stated publicly that he felt it was no longer appropriate for him to voice a black character, and that the role should be performed by a black actor. He stepped away from the role he had originated and played for more than 2 decades. The character was recast with Arif Zahir, who was announced as the new voice of Cleveland in 2020, Akai, and who has voiced the character since then. Henry's decision was widely praised within the industry, and the transition was handled with care by the show's production. The character of Cleveland has continued to appear regularly in Family Guy, and Zahir's performance has been received well by fans who were initially uncertain about the change. It remains one of the more significant casting developments in the show's long history, and it reflected a broader conversation happening across American animation at the same time about who gets to voice which characters and whether the convenience of having one performer cover multiple character types comes at a cost that the industry had been too slow to acknowledge. The story of the cast is, in many ways, the story of the show itself, a collection of people who found each other in a particular moment, who built something together over an improbably long span of time, who weathered changes and controversies and creative ups and downs, and who have continued to show up and do the work even as the world around them shifted in every possible direction. When you watch Family Guy, or more to our purposes tonight, when you let it play softly in the background while you drift towards sleep, you are hearing the same voices that were first assembled in a Fox recording studio in the late 1990s. A little older now, a little more settled into their characters, but still recognizable, still present, still the same ensemble that first said hello to an audience of 22 million people on a Sunday night after the Super Bowl. There is something almost comforting about that continuity when you think about it. Section 4. The first cancellation. When Fox pulled the plug. Let the weight of the following sentence settle in slowly. Fox canceled Family Guy twice before it became one of the most profitable animated franchises in the history of American television. Twice. A show that would eventually generate billions of dollars in merchandise revenue, streaming rights, international licensing, reruns, and DVD sales was deemed, by the network that owned it, not worth continuing. Not once. Twice. The story of how this happened is partly a story about bad decisions at a television network, partly a story about the timing of a show hitting a particular cultural moment before its cultural moment had fully arrived, and partly a story about how the relationship between a show and its audience was changing in ways that nobody in the television industry had quite figured out yet. After the strong premiere performance following the Super Bowl in January of 1999, Family Guy settled into its regular time slot on Fox and began building what it hoped would be a stable audience. The first season ran through the spring of that year, and while the numbers were not at Super Bowl levels, nothing on television is ever at Super Bowl levels after the Super Bowl, they were solid enough to suggest that a real audience had found the show. Season 1 averaged about 12.8 million households in the Nielsen ratings, which placed Family Guy at number 33 in the national rankings for the year. For a new animated comedy aimed at adults, that was genuinely good. The Simpsons had, by this point, been on the air for a decade and was still a ratings powerhouse, and Family Guy was not expected to match its older sibling immediately. The first season numbers suggested that given time and a stable schedule, the show could develop into something significant. The second season began in the fall of 1999, and Fox did something that, in retrospect, seems almost deliberately designed to undermine the show it had just paid handsomely to develop. They moved it. Instead of giving Family Guy the stable schedule it needed to build its audience, Fox moved the show to Thursday nights at 9 o'clock. Thursday at 9 was, in 1999, one of the most brutally competitive time slots on American television. That was when NBC's powerhouse lineup, Frasier most notably, but also ER in the adjacent slot, dominated the landscape. Frasier, the sitcom about a pompous Seattle radio psychiatrist, was in the middle of a remarkable run of success at exactly that moment, winning Emmy Award after Emmy Award and pulling enormous numbers. Putting Family Guy directly against Frasier on Thursday nights was like scheduling a college football game in the middle of the Super Bowl and then being surprised when nobody came. The ratings dropped significantly. Fox, apparently surprised by this outcome that any scheduling professional should have been able to predict, moved the show again, this time to Tuesday nights. Tuesday nights in 1999 and 2000 were dominated by a different cultural phenomenon entirely: Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? The ABC game show featuring Regis Philbin and a format borrowed from British television had become one of the most watched programs in America, airing multiple nights per week and pulling audiences that would be considered extraordinary by contemporary standards. Again, Family Guy found itself in direct competition with something that millions of people had specifically arranged their evenings around. The ratings dropped further. Fox moved the show again and again. Throughout its first 3 seasons, Family Guy inhabited an extraordinary number of different time slots and days, sometimes with very little advance notice to viewers, who found themselves tuning in to what they expected to be a new episode of the show and finding something else entirely. This kind of scheduling chaos is, in the television industry, almost a guarantee of audience erosion. Viewers in the pre-streaming era were creatures of habit. They watched shows on specific nights at specific times, and if the show wasn't in the expected place, many of them simply didn't find it. The idea that audiences would exhaustively track a show's changing schedule or seek out information about where it had moved was, in 1999 and 2000, not a reasonable expectation. People watched what was on when they turned on the television, and if what was on wasn't what they expected, they found something else. There was also the matter of critical reception. The reviewers who covered television in those early years were not uniformly kind to Family Guy. The comparison to The Simpsons was a recurring refrain, a show that was perceived as doing a similar thing but without the same depth or consistency. Some critics found the cutaway gag format clever but ultimately shallow, a way of generating laughs without doing the harder work of character development and narrative coherence. Others found the show's willingness to be offensive, to make jokes about race, religion, disability, and sexuality that other primetime shows would not touch, either liberating or irresponsible depending on their own sensibilities. The show did win admirers. There were critics and viewers who recognized something genuinely original in what Family Guy was doing, who saw the cutaway structure not as a dodge but as an innovation, a new grammar for animated comedy that The Simpsons had not developed and South Park was doing differently. The show had champions, some of them quite vocal. But it did not have unanimous support, and in television, where the economics of advertising mean that every ratings point has a dollar value attached to it, the absence of unanimous support is its own kind of verdict. By the end of Season 2, the ratings had declined substantially from that first season's average. By the end of Season 3, in the spring of 2002, Fox had made a decision. The network canceled Family Guy. Seth MacFarlane has spoken about receiving that news in various interviews, and the accounts are consistent in their description of a man who was deeply disappointed, but not entirely surprised. The scheduling chaos had taken its toll. He knew the ratings numbers. He understood that the network had been moving the show around in ways that made it almost impossible to hold an audience, and he understood that the network's patience had a limit. What he could not have known, what none of them could have known, was that the cancellation was not the end. It was, in fact, the beginning of the most important period in the show's history. Because something peculiar was happening in the culture in those years, something that the television industry had not yet developed the frameworks to fully understand. The entertainment landscape was changing. The way people consumed media was changing. The DVD format had become standard, and the market for television series released on DVD, entire seasons, available for purchase, watchable on your own schedule, without commercials as many times as you wanted, was growing rapidly. And in 2001 and 2002, Cartoon Network had a programming block that was quietly becoming a cultural force. Adult Swim launched as a distinct programming block on Cartoon Network on September 2, 2001. It was designed to air in the late-night hours, targeting an older demographic than Cartoon Network's standard children's programming, and it needed content. The people running Adult Swim were looking for shows that would appeal to the young adult audience that stayed up late and watched television in a different way than the families who watched cartoons in the afternoon. More ironic, more willing to engage with dark or subversive humor, more attracted to things that felt slightly outside the mainstream. Cartoon Network acquired the rights to air reruns of Family Guy after its cancellation. They acquired those rights for almost nothing because after 2 cancellations, nobody at Fox thought Family Guy was worth very much. The deal was, by the standards of television rights transactions, remarkably inexpensive. Cartoon Network essentially picked up a show that its original network had discarded and put it on Adult Swim. The reruns premiered on Adult Swim on April 20th, 2003. Almost immediately, something unexpected happened. Family Guy became the highest-rated show on the entire Adult Swim block. It dominated late-night viewing in a way that nobody had predicted. Viewership numbers climbed week after week. Young adults who had either never seen the show during its original run or who had missed episodes because of the chaotic scheduling found it in reruns and fell in love with it. They told their friends. Their friends watched. Those friends told their friends. Adult Swim's overall viewership during this period increased by 239%. Nearly 2.5 times as many people were watching the block as had been watching before Family Guy arrived. That is an extraordinary number for a rerun package of a canceled show. Simultaneously, something was happening in stores. Fox Home Entertainment released the first season DVD box set of Family Guy in April of 2003, the same month the reruns began on Adult Swim. The DVD sold phenomenally. Over the following months, it sold more than 2 million copies, making it the second best-selling television DVD release in history at that point. When the second season DVD was released, it performed similarly. People were not just watching the reruns, they were buying the show, owning it, watching it multiple times, showing it to people they knew. This combination of cable rerun performance and DVD sales created a feedback loop that the television industry had never quite encountered before. Canceled shows don't usually sell millions of DVDs. Canceled shows don't usually become the highest-rated program on a cable network. Canceled shows in the traditional model of the television industry disappear. Their audience scatters. The world moves on. Family Guy's audience had not scattered. It had, if anything, grown in passion and in size during the years the show was off the air. The fans who found Family Guy in reruns and on DVD were, by multiple accounts, more intensely loyal than the audience for most shows that were still in active production. They were evangelists. They were not content to simply enjoy the show themselves. They proselytized, they converted their friends, they generated online conversation in the early message boards and fan communities of the early internet. Fox noticed. Fox, the network that had canceled Family Guy twice and sold its rerun rights for almost nothing, was now watching those same rerun rights generate extraordinary numbers on a competing cable network. The DVDs their home entertainment division had put out were selling at a rate that had not been projected. The cultural conversation about Family Guy, even a canceled Family Guy, was not dying down. If anything, it was getting louder. In 2004, Fox made the decision to bring Family Guy back. The announcement was made, and it sent a ripple of genuine disbelief through the entertainment industry. Canceled shows come back occasionally, but it is not unheard of. But shows that have been canceled twice, that have been off the air for 3 years, that have had their cast and crew scatter to other projects, those shows do not come back. They simply do not. It had not happened before, not in this way, not on this scale. Seth MacFarlane, receiving the call that Family Guy had been uncanceled, has described the moment with a mixture of elation and trepidation. The elation was obvious. The show he had built was getting another chance. The trepidation was subtler. He knew that 3 years had passed. He knew that the writing staff had dispersed. He knew that the world of the show existed, in his memory and in the memories of the original team, in a specific way, a specific rhythm and tone and set of instincts, and that reconstituting all of that from scratch was going to be harder than it might appear from the outside. The revival was announced, a 4th season was ordered, and Seth MacFarlane found himself in the strange position of having to recreate something that had already been created, to rebuild something that had been allowed to fall apart, and to do it in the full glare of expectations that had been shaped by the show's unexpected second life as a rerun and DVD phenomenon. In the television industry, the cancellation and revival of Family Guy is now taught as a case study. It appears in business school courses about media economics. It appears in journalism school discussions about the changing relationship between producers and audiences. It appears in entertainment law textbooks about the valuation of canceled intellectual property. The lesson it teaches is simple, if not easy to act on. Don't throw things away just because they're not working in the current form. The audience might find them in a different form. The value might be somewhere you're not looking. Fox had thrown Family Guy away, and then Family Guy had come back from the dead to prove it wrong. That's a story that doesn't get old. The specific numbers involved in the Family Guy DVD phenomenon are worth sitting with because they were genuinely shocking to the industry at the time. The Season 1 DVD box set, released in April of 2003, sold over 2 million copies. At the time, that made it the second best-selling television DVD in history, second only to The Sopranos, which was an active, prestige HBO drama at the peak of its cultural influence. The idea that a canceled animated comedy from a network that had abandoned it would outsell nearly every other television DVD on the market was not a prediction that any entertainment analyst would have made. Season 2 performed similarly. The cumulative DVD sales figures for Family Guy across its first 3 seasons ran into the tens of millions of units over the years that followed. The show that Fox had sold its rerun rights for almost nothing was generating enormous revenue through the very format, physical media, owned rather than rented, that the studios and networks were about to realize they had been dramatically undervaluing. The irony was almost literary in its quality. The writers of the 2007 WGA strike, who demanded better compensation for DVD residuals, were making their argument at exactly the moment that Family Guy was providing the most visible proof of their case. Here was a canceled show, a show that nobody at the network thought was worth much, generating more ad revenue than almost anything else on the market. The writers who had worked on those 3 seasons, who had walked away when the show was canceled and rebuilt their careers elsewhere, were not receiving meaningful residual payments from that windfall. The business model that had governed their compensation was built on assumptions about how audiences would consume content that were being visibly disproven in real time. The Family Guy DVD situation helped sharpen the industry's awareness of what was at stake in the residuals conversation, and it did so in the most concrete possible way, by demonstrating that the revenue was real, large, and not being shared with the people who had created the content. Section 6, Interlude. The day Seth MacFarlane should have died, and didn't. There are moments in the histories of creative works that have nothing to do with creativity. Moments where the story of a show or a book or a film brushes up against something so large and so outside the normal frame that it seems to belong to a different kind of story altogether. For Family Guy, that moment arrived on September 11th, 2001, and what happened on that morning is so strange, so heavy with the specific weight of what it almost meant, that it deserves its own telling, even when the purpose of the telling is something as gentle as helping you sleep. On September 11th, 2001, Seth MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11, departing from Boston's Logan International Airport to Los Angeles. He had been on the East Coast for some kind of promotional event or meeting. The exact nature of the trip has never been fully detailed, and Seth has been characteristically reticent about the specific circumstances leading up to that morning. What he has said in various interviews over the years is that he was due to be on that flight. Flight 11 departed at 7:59 in the morning. Approximately 53 minutes into the flight, it was hijacked. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 became the first of the 4 hijacked aircraft to reach its target when it was flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. Everyone on board died. It was the beginning of the worst attack on American soil in modern history. Seth MacFarlane was not on the flight. The reason he was not on the flight was mundane to the point of absurdity. His travel agent had told him the departure time was 8:15 a.m. The actual departure time was 7:45 a.m. When Seth arrived at the airport, he was late, hungover, by his own subsequent account, from the night before, and the gate for Flight 11 was already closed. He had missed it by approximately 10 minutes. 10 minutes, and a wrong departure time, and a night spent in a way he'd rather not have publicized, separated Seth MacFarlane from the nearly 90 passengers and crew of Flight 11. He has spoken about this moment in a small number of interviews, and when he does, the tone is carefully modulated, neither sensationalized nor dismissed, but acknowledged with the seriousness that the proximity to catastrophe demands. He has described learning, later that morning, that the flight he had missed was the one that hit the North Tower. He has described the specific quality of that knowledge, the way it sits differently from ordinary close calls, the way it resists the normal mechanisms of processing a lucky escape because the context makes the word lucky feel inadequate in every direction at once. There is a dimension of survivor's guilt that Seth has acknowledged without going into clinical detail in comments about that day. The awareness that he was alive not because of anything he did or chose, but because his travel agent said 8:15 when the actual time was 7:45, and because he was hungover enough that he arrived late rather than early, that awareness does not lead anywhere clean. It leads into the kind of territory where normal frameworks for thinking about luck and fate and the value of a life start to feel extremely inadequate. From the perspective of Family Guy specifically, and of American television comedy more broadly, the implications of what almost happened on that September morning are almost impossible to sit with directly. The show was, in September 2001, in the middle of its Adult Swim rerun life. It had been canceled from Fox earlier that year, but it was building the cult audience that would eventually force the network's hand. Seth was, at that moment, the animating intelligence behind a show that was between states, not quite dead, not quite alive, waiting for the audience to gather around it in numbers large enough to matter. If he had been on Flight 11, Family Guy's story would have ended there. The characters he voiced, Peter, Brian, Stewie, Quagmire, would have had no one to give them life in the revival. The revival itself, dependent so heavily on Seth's creative presence and commercial value, almost certainly would not have happened. The show would have remained a canceled footnote, an animated comedy that ran for 3 seasons in the late 1990s and early 2000s before being canceled, and then dying with its creator in one of the worst disasters in American history. What actually happened instead is the story we have been telling tonight. The revival, the cultural phenomenon. The 25 years of episodes and controversies and achievements and failures, and all the complicated, imperfect, occasionally brilliant things that Family Guy became. Seth has said that he doesn't dwell on this, that dwelling on it leads nowhere useful, that the healthy response is to acknowledge it and then continue living. The philosopher in him has presumably done some thinking about what the proximity to non-existence implies about the nature of existence itself. The comedian in him probably has some dark jokes ready for the right audience. What it adds to the story of Family Guy is something that can't be quantified or fully articulated. A sense that the show's existence is contingent in a way that most cultural products are not, that the specific combination of circumstances that produced it included a travel agent's mistake and a young man's late night, and that the story of how it came to be is inseparable from the story of how it almost didn't. 10 minutes. A wrong time on a boarding pass. The whole strange, improbable, beloved, flawed, resilient history of a show that was never supposed to be this significant, running in the background of a quiet night while you let your eyes close. There is something there, if you want to look for it, about the randomness that underlies all the things we take for granted. Or you can just let it drift past and settle into sleep. Both are fine. Section 6, Part 2. The Writers' Strike Years. When Hollywood stopped the Writers Guild of America strike that began on November 5, 2007, and lasted until February 12, 2008, was not the first time American television writers had walked off the job, and it would not be the last. But for Family Guy specifically, and for Seth MacFarlane's relationship with both his show and his network, the 2007 to 2008 strike was a pivotal episode that crystallized tensions that had been building for years and left marks that didn't fully fade. The strike was about money, as labor actions almost always are at their core, and it was about the specific form of money that the entertainment industry was generating from new distribution channels. The DVD format had, over the preceding decade, become a massive revenue source for studios and networks. Physical copies of television seasons and films were selling in numbers that had not been anticipated when the residual payment structures that governed how writers were compensated were first established. The writers felt, correctly, that they were not receiving a fair share of that revenue. They also felt correctly that digital distribution, the streaming and download services that were still in relatively early stages in 2007, but that everyone in the industry could see growing rapidly, represented a new frontier where the same problem would replay itself at even greater scale if it wasn't addressed now. So, they stopped working. 11,000 members of the Writers Guild of America, East and West, turned in their scripts, picked up their picket signs, and began walking in circles outside the studios and networks that employed them. The action was disruptive in the precise way that labor actions are designed to be disruptive. It went straight to the production lines, stop the flow of new content, and force the industry to negotiate. Seth MacFarlane was publicly, visibly, and genuinely supportive of the strike. He appeared on the picket lines. He donated to the strike fund. He made statements in support of the writers' demands. This was not performative solidarity. Seth himself came up through the writing ranks, had spent years in writers' rooms, and genuinely understood and shared the financial concerns that were driving the action. His support was consistent with his stated values and with his history as a labor advocate within the industry. But here is where the situation became complicated. Fox, while its own writers were on strike, made the decision to air episodes of Family Guy that had been completed before the strike began. These were finished episodes. The animation was done, the recording was done, the post-production was done. Fox had the contractual right to broadcast them. No contract had been violated. The legal situation was clear. What was less clear, what felt to Seth decidedly unclear, was whether exercising that contractual right while the show's creator was actively supporting a labor action against the network was the right thing to do. Not legally right, relationally right. The kind of right that has to do with the texture of a long working relationship and the implicit understandings that accumulate within it over years. Seth found out that Fox had scheduled the episodes for broadcast essentially the way everyone else found out, through the normal channels of television scheduling information, rather than through any direct communication from the network. He made phone calls. The calls were saillant, by his own characterization, not pleasant. He was angry in the specific way that people get angry when they feel that someone who should understand the importance of a situation has demonstrated that they don't actually understand it at all. Fox aired the episodes. The strike continued. The relationship between Seth and his network absorbed another layer of tension. When the strike ended in February of 2008, Family Guy resumed production and the season was completed. But the strike's effects on the show were real and lasting. Season 6, which had been in the middle of production when the strike began, was shortened to 12 episodes rather than the originally ordered count. The writing staff, which had been in the middle of developing storylines and episode arcs, had to restart from a dispersed and somewhat disrupted state. The specific momentum of a writer's room, the way ideas build on each other, the way an internal language develops within a team working intensively together, was broken and had to be reestablished. This kind of interruption is hard to quantify but real to experience. Television writers' rooms develop a kind of rhythmic coherence over the course of a season, a shared sense of where the show is going, what each character is doing, what emotional register the episodes are operating in. When that rhythm is broken for 3 months, restarting it requires not just resuming the work, but essentially rebuilding the conditions that made the work possible. The 2007 to 2008 WGA strike was followed, 15 years later, by another one. In May of 2023, the Writers Guild of America went on strike again. And in July of 2023, the Screen Actors Guild and American Federation of Television and Radio Artists joined them. The combined action was the most significant Hollywood work stoppage in decades. Nearly every major scripted production in American film and television was affected. Seth MacFarlane was again on the picket lines. His position was again consistent with his previous statements. He believed in the writers' demands, which this time included concerns about artificial intelligence and its potential to replace human creative workers, as well as the familiar questions about streaming residuals. He and the Family Guy showrunners made clear early in the strike that they would not work on their shows while it was ongoing, and they kept to that commitment. The 2023 strike ended in September and October of 2023, with agreements that addressed many of the writers' and actors' core demands. Family Guy, which had been in the middle of producing episodes for its 21st season when the strike began, resumed production with yet another interruption absorbed into its long history. The two strikes together form an interesting thread in the show's biography. A recurring demonstration that the people who make Family Guy are not simply cogs in a commercial entertainment machine, that they have positions and commitments and are willing to disrupt their own livelihoods in service of them. Seth MacFarlane, who has been described in some quarters as the embodiment of Hollywood commercial ambition, has also been on the picket line twice. Those two things are both true and both important. There is also something worth noting about the 2023 strike's focus on artificial intelligence. The concern that AI could be used to replace or diminish the role of human writers in television production was, to many in the industry, the most forward-looking element of the demands. For a show like Family Guy, built on the specific human intelligence of a specific group of writers, finding specific jokes that come from their specific experiences and sensibilities, the prospect of algorithmic content generation was not abstract. It was a direct challenge to the premise that what the writer's room produces has value precisely because it comes from human beings. The manatees pushing idea balls image from South Park, revisited in the context of 2023 AI concerns, takes on a different resonance. What was once a satirical critique of lazy human comedy writing had become, in the changed technological landscape, a description of something that was actually possible. That machines could do something like what the manatees were depicted as doing, and that the resulting content might be good enough for networks that prioritized cost efficiency over quality. Whether that future arrives, and whether Family Guy is still in production when it does, remains to be seen. Section 7. Interlude. Seth MacFarlane's Other Lives. Ted, the Orville, and the man behind the shows. To understand Family Guy fully, you have to understand something about the person who created it, and specifically about the breadth of what that person wanted to do with his time and talent. Seth MacFarlane was never going to be content making one show. The evidence for this is visible in the shape of his career, in the projects he pursued while Family Guy was still very much in production, in the way he talked about his work when he allowed himself to be candid about it. The film Ted, which Seth wrote, directed, produced, and starred in, was released in June of 2012 and became one of the highest-grossing R-rated comedies in the history of American cinema. The film follows John Bennett, a Boston man whose childhood wish brings his teddy bear to life, and the subsequent complications of carrying a foul-mouthed, substance-abusing childhood companion into adult life. It is, at its core, a film about the difficulty of growing up while remaining attached to the comforts of childhood, a theme that is not entirely unrelated to some of Family Guy's more interesting preoccupations. Ted earned over $549 million worldwide, against a production budget of approximately $50 million. It was not a niche success or a cult film. It was a genuine mainstream phenomenon, the kind of global box office performance that changes the way Hollywood thinks about a filmmaker. It was also, critically, a film that Seth had conceived, developed, and shepherded through production while Family Guy was still in full swing, a demonstration that his creative capacity extended well beyond the animated world and that he was capable of building something significant outside of it. The sequel, Ted 2, arrived in 2015. While it performed less spectacularly than the original, earning approximately $216 million worldwide, it was still a commercial success by normal standards, and it kept Seth in the conversation as a filmmaker with genuine commercial reach. He also wrote and directed and starred in A Million Ways to Die in the West in 2014, a Western comedy that performed more modestly but demonstrated his interest in exploring different genres and periods. The Orville, which premiered on Fox in 2017 before moving to Hulu in 2019, represents perhaps the most personally revealing of Seth's projects outside of Family Guy. The Orville is a science fiction series set aboard a mid-level exploratory spacecraft in the 25th century, and it is, by any reasonable assessment, a love letter to Star Trek, specifically to the classic era of the franchise, the episodic, character-driven, optimistic science fiction that Seth grew up watching and that shaped his sense of what the genre could be. The show has been described as a comedy in its early seasons and as something more serious as it continued. What it actually is, beneath either of those categories, is a sincere and often moving exploration of the themes that classic science fiction was best at. Questions about what it means to be human, about how communities navigate difference, about the value of curiosity and the cost of conflict. Seth performs and produces and often writes and directs the show with an investment that is different in quality from what he brings to Family Guy in its later years. More urgent, more personal, more clearly driven by something he wants to say rather than something he is contractually obligated to make. The Ted prequel series, launched on Peacock in 2024 as a live-action show, continued his expansion into the streaming landscape and his commitment to building his future creative home in the NBC Universal ecosystem rather than at Fox. What all of these projects together tell you about Seth MacFarlane is that Family Guy, for all of its importance to his career and his finances, is not the place where his deepest creative ambitions now live. It is the foundation that makes everything else possible: the reliable income stream, the contractual anchor, the brand association that keeps his name in the conversation. But the Orville is where he goes to say something that matters to him. Ted was where he went to prove he could work in a different medium. The music albums he has released, covers of classic standards, performed with a big band in the tradition he has loved since childhood, are where he goes when he wants to express something that animation cannot contain. The man who created Family Guy at 24 was, in some fundamental way, still becoming himself. The man who continues to voice its characters at 50 has, in many respects, already become who he is. The distance between those two people is the distance that the show has traveled, and it explains a great deal about the show's current state, why it continues, why it is what it is, and why the creative urgency that characterized its best work has been replaced by the steadier, more complicated energy of a professional honoring a commitment. That is not a criticism. Honoring commitments is valuable and admirable. Long careers require it. The people who make Family Guy, the writers, the voice cast, the animators, the editors, the dozens of people whose work appears in the credits at the end of each episode, deserve a creator who shows up, who voices the characters, who keeps the machine running. Seth does that. What he may no longer do is look at the next episode of Family Guy with the same wondering excitement that a 24-year-old looked at his thesis film. But then nobody does anything for the first time twice. Section 5. The Resurrection. The most unlikely comeback in TV history. The phrase comeback story gets used casually in entertainment journalism, applied to athletes who return from injury, musicians who release an album after a long silence, actors who find a new audience after years of diminished visibility. The word is common enough that it has lost some of its weight. But what happened with Family Guy between 2003 and 2005 is a comeback story in the fullest, most literal sense. A show that was genuinely, officially, contractually dead, that had its cast released from their obligations and its production offices shut down, that had been sold off and shelved and written out of Fox's planning documents, came back to life. And it came back bigger than it had been when it died. Season 4 premiered on May 1st, 2005, returning to Fox's Sunday night animation domination block alongside The Simpsons, and a new show that Seth was also executive producing, American Dad, which had launched a few months earlier in February. The return episode drew approximately 11.85 million viewers, a number that thrilled Fox executives, confirmed the commercial logic of their decision to revive the show, and told the story of 3 years of pent-up fan enthusiasm releasing all at once. Seth MacFarlane has described the experience of coming back to the show after 3 years as simultaneously familiar and disorienting. Familiar because the characters lived in him. He had never stopped thinking in Peter's voice, in Brian's voice, in Stewie's voice. The rhythms of those characters were part of his internal landscape in a way that didn't diminish during the years of cancellation. Disorienting because the world had changed. The team had changed, and the specific alchemy that had produced the early seasons was going to need to be reconstructed rather than simply resumed. The writing staff had scattered, as Seth had predicted. Writers who had been in the original room had found other work, other shows, other projects, other careers that had filled the vacuum left by the cancellation. Some of them came back when the show was revived, but not all of them. And those who did come back arrived into a room that was already populated by new writers who had never worked on Family Guy before. The resulting writing room for Season 4 was a hybrid, part original DNA, part new material. And the show that emerged from it reflected that hybrid quality in ways that longtime fans could detect, even if they couldn't always name what was different. One of the changes that was visible almost immediately was in the animation. The early seasons of Family Guy had been produced by multiple studios. Season 1 was handled by Plus One Animation. Seasons 2 and 3 were animated primarily by Rough Draft Studios, a Los Angeles-based company with a reputation for expressive, energetic work that gave the characters a loose, slightly sketchy quality that many fans associated with the show at its best. Rough Draft also animated The Simpsons, and the sensibility they brought to Family Guy had some of the same lively, handcrafted feeling that made the early Simpsons episodes look and feel the way they did. For the revival, different studios handled the animation. The outlines on the characters became thicker and cleaner. The movements became more fluid in some ways, but less spontaneous in others. The show looked more polished, and to the eye of someone who loved the original, slightly more corporate. Seth has acknowledged in various interviews that the animation change was noticeable and that he had mixed feelings about it. The rougher, more energetic quality of the early seasons was something he valued, and the cleaner look of the revival, while technically accomplished, did sacrifice something in the process. The cutaway gags, which had always been part of the show's identity, became more frequent and more central in the revival seasons. This is perhaps the most significant structural change from the original run to the post-revival run. And it happened for reasons that are understandable even if the results were, over time, somewhat debilitating for the show's narrative quality. Cutaway gags are, in the abstract, a brilliant innovation. They allow a comedy writer to insert a joke into a scene without stopping the scene's forward momentum. You cut away, deliver the joke, cut back, and continue. They are efficient, they are infinitely adaptable, and they generate the kind of short, self-contained comedic moments that spread easily through social networks and internet video platforms. When YouTube launched in 2005, the same year Family Guy came back, the cultural environment suddenly rewarded exactly the kind of bite-sized comedy that a well-crafted cutaway gag provides. Fans could clip out a 30-second cutaway, upload it, and watch it accumulate millions of views in a way that a full episode never could. This created an incentive structure that, over time, pushed the show toward producing more and more of these self-contained moments at the expense of the larger narrative structures that had held the early episodes together. The show became, progressively, a delivery mechanism for viral moments, rather than a collection of complete stories. Each episode's main plot got thinner as more time was allocated to the cutaways. The characters spent less time in genuinely developed situations, and more time delivering setup lines that would justify jumping to something entirely unrelated. The revival also coincided with a period of genuine artistic ambition on the show's part. Season 4 and Season 5 produced some of what many critics consider the best individual episodes the show ever made. Brian and Stewie, an episode in Season 8 that stripped the show down to two characters locked in a bank vault, having real conversations about loneliness, alcoholism, suicidal ideation, and love, remains one of the most praised episodes in the series. Road to Rhode Island, Road to Rupert, and the various other entries in the Road to series of Brian and Stewie adventures were fan favorites that showed the show at its most creative and character-driven. And there were moments in the revival period that revealed a production that was genuinely trying things, genuinely taking risks, genuinely interested in surprising its audience rather than simply satisfying it. Seth brought a level of musical ambition to the show that animated television rarely attempts. Elaborate song and dance numbers, parodies of Broadway musicals, full orchestral performances that demonstrated his genuine love of that tradition. The Simpsons had done musical episodes, but Family Guy's musical moments had a different flavor, more theatrical, more obviously personal to Seth's own tastes, and occasionally more emotionally unexpected. A show about a crude, sometimes horrible man and his dysfunctional family would periodically stop dead and deliver a 5-minute musical sequence of genuine artistry. And the juxtaposition between those two registers was one of the show's distinctive pleasures. The return also brought Seth into a new phase of public prominence that the original run had only hinted at. He became, in the mid to late 2000s, one of the most recognizable figures in American television comedy. Not just as the creator of Family Guy, but as a performer, a writer, a director, and increasingly as a public intellectual in the comedy space. He hosted awards shows. He appeared on talk programs. He gave interviews in which he expressed opinions about politics, culture, and the state of American media that were sometimes controversial and always clearly his own. He became, in short, a celebrity, not just a craftsman working behind the scenes, but a figure with a public persona and a public voice. This elevation brought new pressures and new complications. The man who had pitched a 7-minute pilot to Fox in 1998, when he was relatively unknown and his leverage was essentially zero, was now a man who could take meetings with studio heads as an equal, who could push back on network notes with the authority of genuine commercial success behind him. But success also brought obligations to the show, to Fox, to the audience that had come back and demanded more, And those obligations would eventually begin to pull against his other ambitions and interests. The revival had worked. The audience had come back. The show was profitable again, more profitable than it had ever been during its original run. And from Fox's perspective, that profitability created an almost irresistible logic. Why would you ever stop making something that makes this much money? It's a logic that Seth MacFarlane would, over the following years, find himself both benefiting from and struggling against. For now, though, let that settle into the comfortable territory of having worked out. The canceled show came back. The audience showed up. The machine was running again. And behind the scenes, in a writer's room in a building somewhere in the Los Angeles entertainment complex, a group of funny and slightly sleep-deprived people were sitting around a table figuring out what to do with the second chance they'd been given. Let's go into that room. Section 6. The writer's room, where chaos became comedy. There is a particular piece of furniture that sits at the center of every television comedy production, and that furniture is a table. Not any special table, usually a standard conference room table of the kind you'd find in an insurance company or a law firm, surrounded by chairs of dubious ergonomic quality, covered in the residue of many working lunches. The table is where the writer's room happens. It is where the show is made in the sense that the actual creation of the stories and jokes that constitute an episode of television starts here, around this table in this room, with these specific people talking at each other and occasionally talking past each other, and occasionally saying something that makes everyone else in the room laugh until they have to stop and recover. The Family Guy writer's room, by multiple accounts from people who have passed through it, has always been a place of high energy and mild chaos. Seth MacFarlane established certain foundational elements of the room's culture in the original seasons that persisted, at least in spirit, even as the specific personnel changed over the years. One of those elements was the pitch. In most television writers' rooms, a writer who has an idea for a joke or a scene will describe it, will use words to convey what the moment looks like, why it's funny, what the punchline is. In the Family Guy room, the culture developed early around performing the pitch. If you had a cutaway gag to suggest, you didn't just describe it, you acted it out. You did the voices. You threw yourself into it with enough physical commitment to convey not just what the joke was, but how it should be delivered, what the energy of the moment needed to be. The writers who thrived in this environment were the ones who were, in a sense, performers as well as writers. People who could make the room laugh in the moment, who could demonstrate the joke rather than just explain it. This performance culture created a specific dynamic. The room rewarded extroversion and quick-twitch comedic instinct. Writers who were quieter, who worked more slowly, who needed time to develop an idea before bringing it to the table, sometimes found the environment challenging. The speed at which ideas were pitched, evaluated, accepted, or discarded was exhilarating for some and overwhelming for others. The turnover in the Family Guy writing staff over the years has been somewhat higher than average for a long-running show, and some of that turnover can be attributed to the specific demands of the room's culture. The original writing staff that Seth assembled for the first 3 seasons included a number of people who would go on to significant careers in their own right. Chris Sheridan, who was one of the early executive producers, helped shape the show's narrative sensibility in the original run. Danny Smith and Gary Janetti, both of whom have spoken in various venues about their experiences on the show, contributed to the distinctive voice of those early seasons. Ricky Blitt, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, and others formed the core of a room that was small enough to maintain a consistent vision, but creative enough to generate the volume of material that a weekly animated comedy requires. The volume issue is worth dwelling on because it is one of the less glamorous but more consequential realities of producing a comedy like Family Guy. An episode of television is approximately 22 minutes of finished content. A season consists of between 15 and 22 episodes, depending on the year. That means the writer's room must generate somewhere between 330 and 484 minutes of completed comedy per season. And that is the finished version, the pruned and edited version. The raw material that goes into producing that much finished content is vastly greater. Jokes that don't work. Storylines that are pitched and outlined and then abandoned. Cutaway gags that get written and recorded and then cut in the editing room because they run too long or don't fit the flow of the episode or simply aren't as funny as something else. The Family Guy room, during the original seasons and again during the revival, managed this volume problem partly through sheer energy. A room full of writers who were genuinely motivated, who found each other funny, who were excited about the show, and partly through a structural approach to the cutaway gag that was somewhat different from how other comedies handled their jokes. The cutaway format allowed writers to contribute individual moments that stood alone, that didn't require extensive integration with the larger plot of the episode. A writer could pitch a cutaway gag that was self-contained, funny in isolation, and potentially usable in multiple different episodes depending on the setup that preceded it. This modularity was part of what made the cutaway system efficient as a production tool, even as it contributed over time to the episodic looseness that critics identified as the show's main structural weakness. The South Park creators, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, made this criticism explicit in their 2006 two-episode arc Cartoon Wars, in which they depicted Family Guy's jokes as being generated by manatees, specifically a tank of manatees pushing idea balls together, with each ball representing a random concept, and the joke being the random collision of those concepts. The bit was pointed and funny, and more than a little mean, and it landed because there was a kernel of truth in it. Some Family Guy cutaways did feel like random juxtapositions rather than carefully crafted jokes. What was interesting about the response from within the Family Guy production was not defensiveness, but a kind of rueful acknowledgement. Seth himself, in DVD commentaries and interviews, described the South Park critique as funny and accurate, not accurate about the show's best work, but accurate about a certain tendency that the format encouraged. The Family Guy writers reportedly adopted the term manatee jokes as internal shorthand for cutaways that were random without being clever, collision-generated rather than carefully constructed. The self-awareness was there. The ability to consistently act on it was another matter. The show's writers have described, in various interviews and podcast appearances over the years, a room that was shaped significantly by Seth's presence when he was there, and noticeably different when he wasn't. In the early seasons, Seth was deeply involved in the day-to-day creative decisions. He sat in the room. He pitched. He responded to other people's pitches. He made the calls about what was funny and what wasn't, what was too far and what wasn't far enough, what direction a storyline should take. The show had a strong creative center, and that center was him. As his other commitments multiplied, American Dad, which launched in 2005, the film Ted, which he wrote and directed and starred in, beginning in the late 2000s. The various other projects that claimed his attention, his presence in the Family Guy writers' room became less constant. He moved, over time, from the role of hands-on creative director to something closer to executive overseer, someone who received materials, gave notes, approved decisions, but was not sitting at the table when the decisions were being made. The show's current showrunners, Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, who have helmed the production for much of the post-2011 period, are competent and experienced television professionals who know the show intimately. But there is a difference, a felt, atmospheric difference that people in the room can describe, even if they're careful about exactly how they describe it, between the room with Seth in it and the room without him. The writing staff has also evolved in composition in ways that matter. For most of its early run, the Family Guy writers' room was composed almost entirely of men. This is not unusual in American comedy television. The industry has historically underrepresented women in writers' rooms, particularly in rooms that specialized in the kind of transgressive, boundary-pushing comedy that Family Guy was known for. The show's treatment of Meg Griffin, the sustained comedic cruelty directed at the show's main female teenager, was identified by critics and by some members of the production itself as partly a product of a room that lacked the perspective of the women who might have pushed back against that treatment. Starting around season 14, as the show began to moderate the most extreme elements of Meg's abuse, the writing staff had begun to include more women. The connection between the demographic shift in the room and the change in how Meg was written is something that multiple people connected to the show have acknowledged, some explicitly, some in more hedged terms. The room got more diverse. The show got, in at least this one specific respect, a little less cruel. The physical space of the writer's room has, over the decades, resided in various buildings within the Fox lot in Century City, and then later at other production facilities as the show's corporate home changed. Writers have described a room that is decorated with character sketches and production art, where the walls accumulate the evidence of years of work. Storyboards, reference images, props from particularly elaborate episodes. The whiteboards where story structures are mapped out in colored markers. The piles of scripts in various states of revision. The snack situation, which, by all accounts, is taken seriously. There is a well-established principle in Hollywood that writers' rooms run better when the snack situation is handled with appropriate care. The late-night culture of the room, especially in the original seasons when deadlines were tight and the pressure to produce was constant, produced a camaraderie that multiple alumni have described as one of the more meaningful professional relationships of their lives. The hours are long. The emotional investment is real. The experience of making something funny with a group of people who trust each other enough to say outrageous things, who will catch the things that go too far and support the things that are just right, that experience is not entirely unlike the experience of being in a band, or on a sports team, or in any other collective endeavor, where the outcome depends on the group functioning as more than the sum of its parts. Family Guy has had that quality, at its best. It has not always had it. But in the periods when it has, the work has shown it. One detail from the revival period that rarely gets mentioned in the broader retellings of the show's history. The writers who returned for season 4 found themselves in an unusual emotional position, one that does not have a clean name in the vocabulary of professional creative work. They were returning to something that had been gone long enough to have become memory, not a current reality, but a recalled one. And they were being asked to make it present again. To bring back not just the characters and the world, but the specific quality of attention and care that had produced the original seasons. This is harder than it sounds. Memory distorts. What you remember about a creative period, the ease of it, the fun of it, the way ideas seemed to flow, is not always an accurate record. The original seasons of Family Guy were not effortless. They were produced under deadline pressure, with a small team, through the ordinary friction of creative collaboration. The memory of them, burnished by 3 years of absence and the particular golden glow that cancellation had placed over them, was in some ways more beautiful than the reality had been. The writers who came back were not returning to something that had existed the way they remembered it. They were returning to something they would have to remake from their memory of it, which is not the same thing. Some of them managed this brilliantly. Some of them found it harder than they expected. The best episodes of seasons 4 and 5 are, in many ways, the product of people who remembered exactly why the original seasons worked and had the skill to reconstruct that quality from memory. The weaker episodes are the product of people reconstructing a memory that had, in the reconstruction, lost some essential quality of the original. Section 7. The South Park War and the Great Animated Rivalries. The history of American animated television comedy is not, contrary to what a casual observer might assume, a harmonious landscape in which creators encourage and uplift one another, generously sharing audiences and celebrating each other's successes. It is, rather, a landscape shaped by genuine competition, occasional antagonism, deeply held aesthetic disagreements, and at least one very public feud that produced some of the most talked-about television of the mid-2000s. Family Guy has been in competition with The Simpsons for its entire existence. This was always the comparison, always the shadow under which the show operated, always the first thing a certain kind of critic reached for when writing about it. The Simpsons had arrived first, had established the grammar of adult animated comedy, had accumulated its own legend and mythology, and Family Guy was, whatever its actual intentions and merits, going to be measured against it. Seth MacFarlane acknowledged this reality from early on, and his relationship with it evolved over the years from something he found somewhat irritating to something he seemed to accept with a kind of pragmatic equanimity. But the rivalry that generated the most heat, the most specific creative hostility, and the most memorable television was not between Family Guy and The Simpsons. It was between Family Guy and South Park. South Park, created by Trey Parker and Matt Stone, premiered on Comedy Central in August of 1997, roughly a year and a half before Family Guy. Like Family Guy, it was an adult animated comedy that pushed hard against the limits of what broadcast or cable television would permit in terms of content. Like Family Guy, it had been a cultural phenomenon that surprised the entertainment industry with its speed and intensity of audience adoption. But the two shows were, in tone and philosophy, quite different. South Park was built on a kind of satirical rigidity. The show had political and moral positions that it argued for, with ferocity and consistency, and it was willing to offend anyone and everyone in the service of making those arguments. Family Guy was built more on comedic anarchy. It had a political sensibility, generally liberal, occasionally preachy through Brian's character, but its primary engine was not argument, but absurdity. Trey Parker and Matt Stone did not find Family Guy funny. This is not speculation. They have said so publicly in several interviews over the years. Their criticism was specific. They felt that Family Guy's jokes were random, that the cutaway format was a way of avoiding the harder work of actual comedy construction, that you could replace any cutaway with any other cutaway and nothing would change because none of them connected to anything. The manatee metaphor, which they would develop more fully in Cartoon Wars, captured this critique with a precision that stung because it was partly true. Cartoon Wars was a two-part episode of South Park that aired in April of 2006 during the show's 10th season. The premise involved Cartman, one of South Park's main characters, a child of monstrous selfishness and occasional insight, launching a campaign to get Family Guy canceled because one of the upcoming episodes was going to depict the Prophet Muhammad on screen. The episode was, on one level, a commentary on the controversy surrounding the Danish cartoon depictions of Muhammad that had generated international protests earlier in 2006. But it was also, very clearly, an extended critique of Family Guy as a creative endeavor. In the episode, the depiction of the Family Guy writers as literal manatees, creatures without intelligence, pushing idea balls together randomly, generating jokes through mechanical accident rather than genuine creative thought, was the central comedic conceit. Parker and Stone were making a specific and somewhat devastating argument that Family Guy's comedy required no skill, no craft, no actual wit, that any sufficiently random process could produce the same results. The Family Guy production's response to Cartoon Wars was, by Seth MacFarlane's own telling, relatively measured. He described the South Park critique as funny and accurate in one notable interview, which is a response so diplomatically self-deprecating that it manages to simultaneously acknowledge a legitimate criticism and deflect its sting. The characterization of Family Guy's best work as manatee jokes was not, Seth seemed to suggest, entirely fair, but the characterization of its worst work was not entirely unfair either. Within the Family Guy writers' room, the term entered the vocabulary. Writers began using manatee joke to describe the specific kind of cutaway that was random without being clever, that collided concepts without generating genuine surprise or insight. It became a quality standard, a thing to avoid, a shorthand for lazy. Whether the room consistently avoided it is a question the show's critics would answer differently than its defenders. The South Park rivalry also produced a response from Family Guy that was more direct, if less artistically memorable. In a 2009 episode titled Spies Reminiscent of Us, Peter and Quagmire encounter two spies who bear a strong resemblance to Stan and Kyle from South Park. The meta-reference was clear, and it was designed to zing back. It was not, by most critical assessments, as effective as Cartoon Wars had been, which perhaps proved something about the different modes in which the two shows operated. What Cartoon Wars also revealed, and this was less about Family Guy than about the broader landscape of American animation, was that Parker and Stone had allies in their critique. After the South Park episodes aired, word filtered back through the entertainment industry that writers from The Simpsons and King of the Hill had contacted Parker and Stone to thank them for making those episodes. This detail, reported in various entertainment journalism contexts over the years and never explicitly denied by anyone who would know, suggested that the frustration with Family Guy's approach to comedy was not limited to South Park's creators, but was shared, at least privately, by people working on some of the other major animated comedies of the era. The Simpsons relationship is perhaps the more complicated one, because it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The Simpsons preceded Family Guy, established much of the template Family Guy used, and still occupies a position in the cultural memory of animated comedy that no other show has surpassed. Matt Groening and James L. Brooks, who created and produced The Simpsons, have been generally diplomatic in public about their relationship with Family Guy, acknowledging it as a successful show, occasionally expressing admiration for specific elements, without engaging in anything like the explicit antagonism of Cartoon Wars. But there have been moments of friction. The Simpsons made references to Family Guy over the years that ranged from gentle to pointed. Family Guy made references to The Simpsons that ranged from affectionate to cutting. The two shows existed in the same cultural space, both airing on Fox on Sunday nights, both competing for the same audience demographic, both representing different philosophies about what adult animated comedy should be, and the tension between those philosophies occasionally surfaced. The most visible moment of Simpsons Family Guy interaction was the crossover episode that aired in 2014, titled The Simpsons Guy. In it, the Griffin family encounters the Simpson family, and the two shows' universes are placed side by side. The episode was notable partly for the care both productions took in the animation. The character designs had to be adapted so that both shows' visual styles could coexist in the same frame, and partly for the ways in which the writing acknowledged the complicated relationship between the two franchises. Peter and Homer bond over their similarities. The women of both families interact with varying degrees of warmth and friction. Stewie and Bart have a dynamic that plays with the audience's awareness of each character's place in animation history. The episode was viewed by approximately 10 million people, and it was generally received as a genuine and good-natured encounter between two entities that had more to gain from acknowledging each other than from continuing to circle warily. The crossover did not end the underlying philosophical disagreement between what The Simpsons represents, character-driven, emotionally grounded, satirically sophisticated, and what Family Guy at its most extreme represents. But it was a moment of détente, of two long-running institutions acknowledging their coexistence with something approaching affection. There is one more rivalry worth mentioning, which is the rivalry that lived inside the Fox animation block itself. American Dad, Seth MacFarlane's other show, premiered in the same season that Family Guy was revived, Season 4, 2005, and immediately invited comparisons. American Dad was, in many ways, a counter-thesis to some of Family Guy's creative tendencies. It did not use cutaway gags. Its characters were more consistently developed. Its stories had more internal coherence. It was, in the early seasons, considered the lesser show, the understated companion piece to Family Guy's flag-bearer status. But over the course of many seasons, as Family Guy's critical standing fell and American Dad's rose, the comparison between the two shows became one of the sharper pieces of evidence in the case against the specific creative choices that had been made for Family Guy. The story of Family Guy in competition with everything around it, with The Simpsons, with South Park, with its own better self in the form of American Dad, is a story about the specific pressures that success creates and the specific temptations that commercial success encourages. The easy thing, always, is to do more of what worked. More cutaways, more shock, more of the things that generated the viral clips and the audience reactions and the advertising revenue. The harder thing is to maintain the standards that made the show worth fighting for in the first place. The rivalries that surrounded Family Guy were, in their way, trying to hold the show to those standards, even when the motivation behind the criticism was competitive rather than purely aesthetic. South Park's manatees were, under the provocative packaging, a genuine challenge. Be funnier. Be smarter. Be more than a machine for generating random moments. Whether Family Guy accepted that challenge is, as with so much of its story, a question that has different answers depending on which season you're watching. There is something worth dwelling on in this whole competitive landscape, which is that the arguments being made by Family Guy's critics, from South Park's manatees to The Simpsons writers' quiet appreciation of cartoon wars, were arguments that the people inside the Family Guy production sometimes agreed with. Seth MacFarlane is not a man who lacks self-awareness. He has, in various contexts, been quite candid about the show's weaknesses, about the ways in which the cutaway dependency grew beyond what he would have chosen, about the ways in which specific character decisions went further than he might have sanctioned if he had been more present. The tragedy of the show's decline, if tragedy is the right word for the gradual diminishment of a television comedy, is not that the people making it didn't know better. It's that knowing better and doing better are two different things, separated by the distance between an artist's instincts and an institution's momentum. Family Guy, by the time it reached its middle and later seasons, had become an institution, A production with hundreds of employees, with contractual obligations, with a schedule that required a certain volume of output regardless of whether the creative inspiration was fully there. Institutions do not change easily, even when the people inside them can see clearly what needs to change. The rivalries mattered because they kept the pressure on. South Park's mockery, even when it stung, was a form of accountability. The Simpsons' legacy, even when it felt unfair, was a standard. American Dad's growing quality, even when it was uncomfortable to acknowledge, was a mirror. The best work that Family Guy ever did happened in the tension between what the show was at its laziest and what it could be at its best. The rivalries kept that tension alive, even when everything else about the show's situation encouraged comfort and repetition. Section 8. Fox versus MacFarlane. A failing marriage. Somewhere in the middle of Seth MacFarlane's long relationship with Fox Broadcasting, the marriage metaphor took hold. He used it himself in one of his more candid public statements about the situation, comparing the relationship to a marriage that both parties knew was not working anymore, but that neither side had quite figured out how to exit. It's an apt metaphor, not just for its emotional resonance, but for its structural accuracy. The relationship between a television creator and the network that airs their show has all the features of a long partnership that started with genuine mutual enthusiasm and then evolved, over years of negotiated compromises and accumulated resentments, into something considerably more complicated. Fox and Seth MacFarlane began their relationship in the way all good creative partnerships begin, with money and excitement and the shared belief that what they were making together was worth making. Fox had given Seth a development deal worth millions of dollars when he was 24 years old. Fox had put Family Guy in the coveted post-Super Bowl slot for its premiere. Fox had believed in the show enough to order it in the first place, and then, after not one but two cancellations, had believed in it again enough to bring it back. That second revival, in 2005, represented Fox committing to Family Guy in a way that was genuinely unusual. The network placed the revived show at the center of its animation domination Sunday night lineup, alongside The Simpsons, and gave it the promotional support and scheduling stability that it had not had during its original run. The bet paid off commercially. Family Guy was profitable. It was, for several years after its return, one of Fox's most valuable entertainment properties. But commercial success does not automatically produce creative harmony, and over the years following the revival, the relationship between Seth and Fox accumulated friction from multiple directions simultaneously. The first major flashpoint was the Writers Guild of America strike of 2007 and 2008. This was a labor action of significant scale. Thousands of television and film writers refused to work, demanding better compensation for DVD residuals and emerging digital distribution platforms. The strike began in November of 2007 and lasted until February of 2008, disrupting production across virtually all of Hollywood's scripted television programming. Seth MacFarlane was a strong and visible supporter of the strike. He walked the picket lines. He made his position public. He was, by any measure, genuinely committed to the writers' cause rather than performing solidarity for appearance purposes. Family Guy Season 6, which was in production when the strike began, was directly affected. Episodes in production were halted. The season, which would ultimately have 12 episodes, was shortened from its original order. And then Fox did something that Seth found not just disappointing, but genuinely infuriating. While the strike was ongoing, Fox made the decision to air 3 episodes of Family Guy that had been completed before the strike began. These were finished episodes, animated, recorded, ready for broadcast, and Fox technically had the contractual right to air them. But airing them while the show's creator was on the picket line supporting the writers who were fighting the network, airing them without his knowledge or consent, without any communication that would have allowed him to at least understand what was being planned, was, in Seth's experience of it, a significant breach of trust. Seth received word that the episodes had been scheduled for broadcast without his involvement. By some accounts, he learned about it when other people did, through the normal channels of television scheduling, rather than through any direct communication from the network. He placed a phone call to Fox executives that, depending on who's telling the story, lasted between 45 minutes and over an hour and included language that was, to use a gentle description, direct. He was furious. Not primarily about the episodes being aired. The contractual reality was that Fox had the right to do what it did, but about how it was done, about the quality of the communication, about what it said about how the network viewed its relationship with him. The incident was, in the macro history of the show, a relatively small moment. The episodes aired, the world continued. The strike ended in February of 2008 and Family Guy resumed production. But the episode left a mark on Seth's relationship with Fox that didn't fully heal, and it contributed to an accumulation of grievances that would eventually find their most public expression more than a decade later. That more public expression came in 2021, when Seth posted on social media about Tucker Carlson, who at the time was one of Fox News' highest-profile hosts. Carlson's commentary, which included content that Seth found offensive and irresponsible, had been generating public controversy, and Seth weighed in with characteristic directness. He described his relationship with Fox as akin to a failing marriage, expressed discomfort with being associated through his Fox affiliation with content he found antithetical to his values, and made clear that given the choice, he would rather his show be on any other network. The statement made news. It was the creator of one of Fox's longest-running shows publicly saying, in effect, that he wanted out. It was also, for anyone paying attention to the entertainment industry's internal politics, not entirely surprising. The tension between Seth MacFarlane's stated values, progressive, secular, pro-science, anti-authoritarian, and the political atmosphere associated with the Fox brand had been visible for years. The post wasn't revealing something new. It was making explicit something that had been subterranean for a long time. Fox's response was careful and measured, as major corporations' responses tend to be when a valuable creative partner says something that could be read as a public criticism. There was no dramatic confrontation, no severing of the relationship, no announcement of the show's cancellation in response to the post. Family Guy continued to air on Fox. Seth continued to voice his characters. The institution continued to function because institutions, particularly profitable ones, are very good at absorbing interpersonal friction and continuing on. But Seth had by this point already taken a significant step in a different direction. In January of 2020, he signed a major deal with NBC Universal, reported to be worth approximately $200 million over 5 years. The deal moved his production company, Fuzzy Door Productions, into the Comcast family of companies. His newer projects, The Orville, the TED television series, were being developed for platforms that had nothing to do with Fox. He was, professionally, already building his future elsewhere. Family Guy was the cord still tying him to the network, and it was a cord he hadn't yet cut because cutting it would require ending or selling the show, and ending the show raised its own complicated set of financial and contractual questions. The result was an unusual situation by the standards of the television industry. A creator who did not particularly want his show on the network where it aired, who had publicly said so, who was spending the majority of his creative energy on projects for other companies, but who was still voicing the characters every week because that was what his contract required, and because the show, however he felt about its situation, was something he had built and remained responsible for. In April of 2025, Fox, now operating as a unit under the Disney corporate umbrella after the 2019 acquisition of most of 21st Century Fox, renewed Family Guy through season 27. The renewal would take the show through the 2028 to 2029 television season, which would coincide with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season under the new deal would consist of 15 episodes. It was described in entertainment press as a mega deal, a term that conveyed both the scale of the financial commitment and the somewhat grandiose quality of renewing a show with declining ratings for 4 more seasons, when the creative situation behind it was, to put it generously, ambiguous. Seth MacFarlane's response to the renewal was, in the April 2024 Los Angeles Times interview that preceded the deal, characteristically honest. He said he didn't see a good reason to stop. He mentioned that the show had reached what he called escape velocity, had been running so long that there was no logical endpoint unless the audience stopped watching. He talked about the show's financial utility, the licensing revenue, the ability to support causes he cared about through the show's profitability. He did not talk about exciting creative directions he wanted to explore or stories he was eager to tell. This is, when you sit with it, a somewhat melancholy portrait of a creator's relationship with his most famous creation. The man who pitched those 7 minutes of animation in 1998 with his whole heart, who built a writer's room from scratch and assembled a cast and created a world out of nothing. That man was now describing the show's continued existence, primarily in terms of revenue and inertia. It made sense to keep going as a reason to keep making a show. But it is a very different reason from "I have something to say." The marriage metaphor, then, is still apt. Long marriages often continue not because they are at their best, but because of everything they've built: the children, the shared property, the decades of accumulated history that make separation seem, on balance, more complicated than continuation. Fox and Seth MacFarlane have Family Guy as their shared custody arrangement, and both parties appear to have decided, for now, that continued coexistence is preferable to the alternative. What neither of them can know from this vantage point is how the story ends. 30 years is a long time for any creative endeavor. The show that debuted after the Super Bowl in 1999, that was canceled twice and came back from the dead, that generated some of the funniest and some of the most critically savaged television of its era, is still running, still airing, still producing episodes on a Wednesday night on a network that was not its original home in the schedule. And somewhere in a recording booth in Los Angeles, Seth MacFarlane still shows up and says hello in Peter Griffin's voice. There is one element of the Fox-MacFarlane relationship that doesn't fit neatly into the business and resentment narrative, and that is the matter of genuine creative support. Fox, for all of its commercial instincts and scheduling missteps, did give Seth MacFarlane resources and freedom that allowed Family Guy to be made with a level of quality that its budget and its position in the programming schedule didn't automatically guarantee. The animation domination block, while born of Fox's commercial interests, also created a culture around adult animated comedy that legitimized the form and gave it a platform it might not have had on another network at that particular moment in television history. The relationship, like most long relationships, is irreducible. It is neither simply a story of corporate exploitation and creative suffering, nor a story of mutual flourishing and grateful partnership. It is a story of two entities that needed each other, that benefited significantly from each other, and that found, over 25 years of increasingly strained coexistence, that the need did not equal the comfort and the benefit did not equal the peace. Seth MacFarlane made something extraordinary. Fox housed it and profited from it and occasionally made decisions about it that he found infuriating. Neither of those things cancels the other out. They are both, simultaneously, true. Section 9, the episodes that almost destroyed everything. Not every episode of Family Guy that provoked controversy did so on purpose. Some of the show's most fraught moments arrived through what looked, from the outside, like calculated provocation, but was, from the inside, something more complicated. A combination of genuine creative intent, misjudged execution, institutional momentum that was hard to stop even when someone wanted to, and the particular chaos that comes from producing 22 minutes of animation every week under deadline pressure. But some episodes were absolutely, deliberately, entirely on purpose, and the stories behind them are among the most interesting in the show's history. The first episode that generated significant controversy was one that never aired during its original intended broadcast window. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was produced during the show's second season and was scheduled for broadcast in the fall of 2000. The episode involves Peter, convinced that Jewish people are uniquely intelligent and financially gifted, trying to find a Jewish friend who can help him manage his money and eventually trying to convert Chris to Judaism so that Chris might benefit from the same supposed advantages. The premise, by today's standards, reads as the kind of comedy that requires very careful handling to not simply reinforce the stereotypes it claims to be examining. The episode attempts to walk a specific line, acknowledging the absurdity of Peter's beliefs while also, through the character of Max Weinstein, allowing a Jewish character some genuine dignity and humor. Whether it succeeds in walking that line is something that different viewers have evaluated differently. Fox decided not to air it. The network's Standards and Practices division looked at the episode and concluded that the religious content, particularly a song Peter sings called "I Need a Jew," was too potentially offensive to broadcast on a major network at prime time. The episode sat in the can. It was not aired on Fox when originally intended, not in Season 2, and not for several years thereafter. When Adult Swim acquired the Family Guy rerun package in 2003, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was included in the library and was broadcast on Adult Swim, where it found an audience without apparent incident. Fox eventually broadcast the episode in 2004 after the show had been revived, slotting it into season four's run and essentially resolving the question of whether it would ever air on the original network by simply airing it. The legal aftermath of the episode was more complicated. In 2009, 9 years after the episode was originally produced, a lawsuit was filed that alleged the song "I Need a Jew" infringed on the copyright of a different song. The lawsuit wound through the court system for several years before being resolved in favor of the Family Guy production. But the litigation added an extra layer of legal complexity to an episode that had already generated enough attention for other reasons. The more significant and more culturally loaded episode that was suppressed entirely and never broadcast in the United States is Partial Terms of Endearment, which was produced as the season 8 finale in 2010. The episode involves Lois agreeing to serve as a surrogate mother for a couple unable to have children, then being left in a difficult situation when the couple dies in an accident midway through the pregnancy. The episode centers on the question of abortion in a direct and unambiguous way, presenting multiple perspectives through the characters' reactions to Lois's situation. Seth MacFarlane was, at the time, and has been since, publicly pro-choice. The episode's treatment of the topic was not neutral. It had a perspective, and that perspective was one that Fox's corporate culture was not prepared to air on its broadcast network. The network decided Partial Terms of Endearment would not air in the United States. It was released on DVD and was broadcast in several other countries, where it aired without the kind of controversy that its suppression in America generated. But American audiences who wanted to see it had to seek it out through non-broadcast channels. Seth's response to the episode's suppression was not passive. He organized what was described as a live table read of the episode, an event at which the cast gathered and performed the episode aloud, drawing an audience and generating press coverage that served, in effect, as a protest against the decision to suppress it. The table read was attended by audience members who were already familiar with the episode's existence through entertainment press coverage. And the event became a kind of public statement about the difference between what a creator wanted to say and what a network was willing to broadcast. The tension this episode revealed is one that runs through the entire history of Family Guy. The show was made by people who wanted to say specific things about the world, to take positions on real issues, to use the platform of a popular animated comedy to engage with subjects that most primetime television avoided. The network that aired the show had commercial and political considerations that sometimes aligned with that ambition and sometimes directly opposed it. The result was a show that was, at various points throughout its run, simultaneously too offensive for broadcast and too commercially valuable to cancel. Several other episodes over the years generated significant real-world consequences. The Season 7 episode 420, which involves Brian leading a campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional New England town where the family lives, was cited by the Venezuelan government as an example of the United States using popular media to promote drug use. The Venezuelan justice minister publicly criticized the episode, and cable stations in Venezuela were warned they could face fines if they continued to broadcast Family Guy. The show was effectively banned in Venezuela as a result, making it, to the best of anyone's knowledge, one of very few American animated comedies to generate a government-level policy response in another country. The show's treatment of various real public figures and institutions occasionally crossed lines that generated complaints, legal threats, and in some cases formal responses. The Catholic Church, which Family Guy has satirized with some frequency over its run, has periodically responded through official channels to episodes it found objectionable. Various advocacy organizations have placed the show on their lists of programs they consider harmful to specific communities. The Parents Television Council, which monitors broadcast television content for material it deems inappropriate, has cited Family Guy with such regularity over the years that the show's position on their lists of most objectionable programming has become something like a permanent fixture. The show has also made jokes about real people that generated direct responses. Episodes that depicted living public figures in unflattering scenarios, not just satirically, but in ways that attributed to them specific behaviors or statements they did not make, produced occasional threats of legal action, some of which required the production to make edits or issue clarifications. The line between satire and defamation in animated comedy is not always as clear as its practitioners might prefer. And Family Guy has on several occasions found itself negotiating that ambiguity in ways that required the involvement of lawyers rather than just writers. One episode deserves particular mention for the personal dimension it added to the show's controversy history. In season 11, the episode Baby Be Mine, the exact title varies slightly in different retellings, touched on content related to the experiences of people with specific medical conditions in a way that, according to advocacy organizations representing those communities, was inaccurate and harmful in its comedic treatment. The production received correspondence from medical professionals and patient advocacy groups, and the episode became a reference point in ongoing conversations about the responsibility that popular culture products have toward the real-world communities they depict, even in a comedic context. None of these controversies alone would constitute a crisis. Television comedies generate controversy regularly. It is, in some sense, part of how they establish their identity and attract the specific audience that values the willingness to go places other shows won't. The controversy is part of the brand. But taken together, across more than 2 decades, the history of Family Guy's disputed episodes tells a story about a show that was genuinely trying to do something, to use comedy to engage with the world, and that sometimes succeeded in doing it brilliantly, sometimes failed in ways that were embarrassing or hurtful, and sometimes found itself in the specific position of having gone further than even its creators had intended. The near misses and the actual disasters are, in retrospect, as interesting as the triumphs. They are the evidence that something real was at stake in the making of Family Guy. That these were not just random gags generated by manatees pushing balls together, but actual choices made by actual people who had actual things they wanted to say and were willing to accept consequences for saying them. Whether those consequences were always worth the saying is, again, a question that has different answers depending on the episode, the context, and who you ask. The thing about playing near the edge is that sometimes you fall off. Family Guy has fallen off several times. The more interesting question is what it learned each time it climbed back up. Section 10. The Death of Brian Abba Dosai Masani. TV's most calculated stunt on November 24th, 2013. The Sunday before Thanksgiving, a date that many American families associate with travel and togetherness and the particular warm anticipation of a holiday approaching, Family Guy killed its most beloved character. Brian Griffin was hit by a car. Not in a cartoon way, not in the exaggerated physical comedy style that had characterized the show's violence in its earlier years. He was hit by a car, he was injured, and then, in a scene that was played for genuine emotional weight rather than comic effect, he died. The Griffin family gathered around him at the veterinarian's office. They said goodbye. Stewie, who had been Brian's closest companion for years, held him as he went. The episode, titled Life of Brian, aired during season 12. The ratings for that season had been declining. The show was, by this point in its run, watching its viewer count shrink, in a way that was consistent, measurable, and not easily reversed through the normal mechanisms of promotion and scheduling. Something had to generate attention. Something had to make people who had stopped watching tune back in, talk about the show, share their reactions with people who might then also tune in. Killing Brian Griffin was that something. The immediate fan response was extraordinary in its scale and intensity. Social media, a different landscape in 2013 than it had been when the show first aired. But now a primary vehicle for the kind of communal television watching experience that used to happen over office coolers and school hallways erupted. Family Guy was trending on every platform. Entertainment news sites ran the story as genuine news, with headlines that conveyed real shock. A fan petition demanding Brian's return launched within hours of the episode airing and gathered over 100,000 signatures in a matter of days. The production's response to this flood of emotional reaction was interesting. Seth MacFarlane posted on Twitter, as it was still called then, and his message was characteristically knowing, "You didn't really think we'd kill Brian for good, did you? Hang tight." The message was simultaneously comforting and infuriating, depending on how you felt about the whole thing. It confirmed what many viewers suspected, that the death was not permanent, while also suggesting that the whole exercise had been somewhat cynical from the beginning. 2 episodes later, on December 15th, 2013, the episode Christmas Guy aired. In it, Stewie, devastated by Brian's absence, unable to function normally, clearly portrayed as being in genuine grief, manages to acquire a time travel device and goes back in time to save Brian from the accident. The dog was pulled out of the path of the car. He lived. Everything went back to exactly the way it had been before the November episode. Vinny, the Italian-American dog voiced by Tony Sirico, best known as Polly Walnuts on The Sopranos, who had been introduced as Brian's replacement, simply vanished from the narrative. 1 month's worth of story was deleted as if it had never happened. At the Television Critics Association press event in January of 2014, Seth MacFarlane spoke openly about the purpose of the arc. He confirmed that it had been designed to generate the exact response it generated. The shock, the emotional reaction, the press coverage, the social media activity, the ratings bump from people tuning in to see what happened next. He said more or less directly that it had worked. The ratings during the death and resurrection period were higher than the season had been managing before. The stunt accomplished its goal. This candor was, in a strange way, more troubling to many fans than the stunt itself. The death of Brian had felt, in the moment of the episode, like something real, like the show was committing to a genuine creative risk, was willing to permanently change itself in service of a story. The immediate telegraphing that it wasn't real, the near-instant reversal, and then the open acknowledgement that the whole thing was a deliberate manipulation of the audience's emotions. All of that combined to produce a response that went beyond disappointment into something closer to feeling used. The Brian death arc became, in critical retrospectives of Family Guy's decline, one of the clearest examples of a show that had lost the ability to distinguish between generating emotion and genuinely earning it. The earlier seasons of Family Guy had produced genuinely emotional moments. Moments of warmth between Peter and Lois, of real friendship between Brian and Stewie, of unexpected tenderness in the middle of apparent chaos. Those moments worked because they were grounded in the established reality of the characters and the world. The Brian death worked as a ratings stunt precisely because it violated that reality, created an emotional response through shock rather than through genuine narrative development, and then retreated from the implications before they could settle into anything real. The episode Brian and Stewie, the Season 8 episode in which the two characters are locked in a bank vault and have extended, honest conversations about loneliness and mortality and the depth of their friendship, is often cited as the best example of what the show's treatment of Brian's relationship with Stewie could be. That episode produced genuine emotional responses in viewers without any deaths, without any stunts, without any social media campaigns. It produced them through writing, through two characters being honest with each other in a way that felt true. The comparison between that episode and the Life of Brian arc is instructive. One achieved emotional resonance through craft. The other attempted to manufacture it through manipulation. The show's best creative instincts and its worst commercial instincts were never more directly visible in the same frame than they were in that strange month of November and December 2013. Brian came back. He has been on the show ever since. Tony Sirico, who voiced Vinny, passed away in 2022, making the replacement character's brief appearance a poignant footnote in the show's history. The last animated role of an actor who had spent decades playing one of the most memorable characters in television drama. The intersection of those two careers, in that brief, strange moment of a November Family Guy episode, is one of the more unexpected connections in the show's long history. The death and resurrection of Brian Griffin did not save the show's ratings in any lasting way. The numbers bump was temporary. The audience that came back to watch the event did not stay in the volumes the production had hoped. The downward trend resumed, and what the arc left behind in the cultural memory of Family Guy's fandom was not the excitement of the stunt, but the afterimage of what it revealed about the show's relationship to its own characters and its own audience. A relationship that, in November of 2013, was tested and found to be more transactional than anyone wanted to admit. Section 11. The characters they almost made, and the ones they lost. Every long-running television show has a hidden history running parallel to the visible one. A shadow version made up of the characters who were almost created, the storylines that were pitched and then abandoned, the casting choices that weren't made, the creative decisions that went one way when they could have gone another. For Family Guy, which has been in production for more than 25 years, this shadow version is extensive. The show that exists is not the only show that could have existed. At dozens of decision points along the way, different choices could have produced a different Family Guy. One that might be better or worse than the one we have, but that would certainly be different. Some of these stories are well documented. Others exist primarily in the memories of the people who were in the rooms where the decisions were made and have surfaced in interviews, podcast appearances, and the general oral history that the entertainment industry generates over time. The character of Cleveland Brown is one of the most interesting examples. Cleveland was conceived as one of Peter's core group of friends from the beginning. Alongside Joe Swanson and Glenn Quagmire, he formed the neighborhood social circle that populated the bar scenes and the various peripheral adventures. Cleveland was gentle, thoughtful, somewhat out of step with the louder energies of the group. And his contrast with Peter's recklessness and Quagmire's aggressive libido gave him a specific comic role that worked well for the show's ensemble dynamic. The decision to spin Cleveland off into his own show was made around season 7, and the Cleveland show premiered on Fox in September of 2009. The premise relocated Cleveland to Stuhlbend, Virginia, where he reconnected with a childhood sweetheart, became a stepfather to her children, and navigated a new community. The show ran for 4 seasons and was canceled in 2013. From behind the scenes, the Cleveland show's production tells a complicated story. It was created partly because the Family Guy production had been so successful that Fox wanted to expand the franchise, and partly because there was a genuine belief that Cleveland's character had dimensions that the ensemble format of Family Guy didn't have room to fully explore. Whether the show delivered on that belief is something that the ratings and the critical reception answered fairly clearly. It was a modest performer that never quite found the specific identity that would have made it essential. When the Cleveland show ended, Cleveland returned to Family Guy, and Mike Henry, then still voicing the character, continued with the role. The spin-off experiment, in retrospect, illuminated something about the specific gravity of ensemble television. Characters who function perfectly within a well-established ensemble can lose something essential when extracted from it. Cleveland worked because of his specific relationship to Peter and Joe and Quagmire, and to the neighborhood that had been built around all of them over years. On his own, without that context, he was interesting, but not quite complete. The character of Meg Griffin is perhaps the most documented example of a character whose intended purpose and actual function diverged so dramatically over the show's run that they became almost unrecognizable as versions of the same creative intent. Meg was designed, in the earliest conception of the show, as the family's anchor, the most grounded, most relatable, most recognizably human character in a household of extreme personalities. She was supposed to be the teenager that teenage viewers could see themselves in, whose struggles with popularity and family and identity were exaggerated but fundamentally real. The character's trajectory, which we've discussed elsewhere in this narration, involved a gradual and then accelerating shift from that original purpose towards something altogether darker. But what's less often discussed is the number of times during that process when the production attempted course corrections that didn't hold, when individual episodes were written that treated Meg with the dignity and complexity the character deserved, and when those episodes were followed by returns to the abusive status quo that suggested the reset button was being applied by something more systemic than any individual writer's decision. Seth MacFarlane has said, in various contexts, that the treatment of Meg was something he had mixed feelings about during the middle seasons. He understood the comedic logic. Meg, as the family's emotional punching bag, served structural functions in the show's dynamics, but he also acknowledged that it went further than he would have chosen if he had been more actively involved in the day-to-day creative decisions during those years. The question of how much of Meg's treatment was intentional creative choice versus accumulated institutional inertia is one that the show's history doesn't fully answer. But the correction that happened around season 14, when the most extreme abuse began to moderate, coinciding with greater representation of women in the writing staff, suggests that the direction was always available, always possible, and simply wasn't chosen until someone in the room pushed for it. There are characters who were designed for the show and didn't quite become what their creators intended. Stewie Griffin is the most significant of these. In the original conception, and Seth has been explicit about this in interviews, Stewie was meant to be genuinely menacing. Not comically menacing, not satirically menacing, but actually threatening. The character was a comment on the violence latent in small children. on the way infants experience the world as being entirely about them and are incapable of empathy in the way adults have learned to perform it. The joke was dark because it was meant to be dark. The baby's plans for world domination and matricide were supposed to be accompanied by a real sense of danger. As the seasons progressed, Stewie's edge softened in ways that the show's creators made a deliberate decision to allow. The world domination plots became rarer. The attempts on Lois's life became more token than genuine. The character evolved into something more emotionally accessible and less frightening. This evolution had real creative costs. The specific, original, irreplaceable quality of Stewie as a villain baby was genuinely one of a kind, and its retirement left a gap that the character's friendship with Brian, however charming in its own right, did not fully fill. There were also characters who were considered and not created, storylines that were outlined and then put aside, and directions the show was pointed in for a while before veering away. The production has, over the years, briefly explored the idea of expanding the cast in significant ways, introducing new family members, new neighbors, new recurring figures who would bring fresh dynamics into the established ensemble. Most of these explorations went nowhere, or produced characters who appeared in one or two episodes and then faded from view. The show's established ensemble had a powerful gravitational pull that made it difficult to add new elements that felt as essential as the existing ones. Glenn Quagmire, to use one example, is a character whose background was expanded in later seasons in ways that revealed both the show's ability to find depth in unexpected places and its tendency to use that depth inconsistently. The revelation of Quagmire's father, a retired Navy veteran who had undergone gender transition and was living as a woman, was handled with surprising care and genuine warmth in the episode that introduced the character. The episode Quagmire's Dad was widely cited as one of the more thoughtful treatments of transgender experience in primetime animation at the time of its broadcast. But, like so many of Family Guy's better impulses, the maturity of that specific episode was not consistently applied to the character or the subject in subsequent appearances. The characters they almost made, and the characters they made but then changed, and the characters they kept but treated differently than they were originally intended to be treated. All of this constitutes a kind of alternative history of Family Guy that runs alongside the actual history. It is a history of roads not taken, choices not made, possibilities not realized. It is also, when you look at it with the full perspective of the show's 25-plus years, a reminder of how much the specific decisions of specific people in specific rooms shaped what the show became. Nothing about Family Guy's trajectory was inevitable. At every point where the show changed, where a character was altered, where a creative emphasis shifted, where a tone changed, there were alternatives available. The people in the room chose the direction they chose for reasons that were sometimes purely creative, sometimes commercial, sometimes the result of fatigue or haste or the practical realities of a weekly production schedule that doesn't always give you time to think carefully about the long-term implications of what you're doing. The shadow history of Family Guy is a useful reminder that television shows, like everything else made by people, are contingent. They are not natural phenomena. They don't develop the way rivers develop, following the inevitable contours of the landscape. They develop the way human decisions develop, chaotically, imperfectly, shaped by the specific combination of talent and limitation and luck and intention that happens to be present in a particular room on a particular day. The show that exists is the show that was made. The show that could have been made is the show that haunts it. One character who exists in the show's history in a particularly strange way is Vinny, the Italian-American dog who replaced Brian for approximately 1 month after the death arc of Season 12. Vinny was voiced by Tony Sirico, a casting choice that connected the Family Guy universe directly to one of the most culturally significant presences in American drama. Sirico's 9-year run as Paulie Walnuts on The Sopranos had made him one of the most recognized faces in television, and his voice carried with it the entire weight of that character's cultural resonance. Vinny appeared in 3 episodes before Brian was resurrected. He was warm, funny, in a different register from Brian, and possessed of a specific energy that several reviewers noted as genuinely distinctive. Some fans, in the immediate aftermath of Brian's return, expressed something like genuine regret that Vinny hadn't been given more time. Tony Sirico passed away on July 8, 2022, at the age of 79. His death made the Family Guy episode in which he appeared a small, strange, temporary role in a show he'd done as a brief guest engagement. The final animated work of a career that had encompassed decades of film and television performance. The connection is oblique. Vinny is a footnote in Family Guy's history, a placeholder character who existed to be replaced. But Sirico's death cast that footnote in a different light, made the 3 episodes he voiced into something more permanent and more meaningful than they were designed to be. This is one of the ways that long-running shows develop gravity over time. The events of the real world accumulate around them, connecting the fictional characters and storylines to real lives and real losses in ways that the original creators could not have planned for. Family Guy has been on the air long enough that several people connected to it have died, that cultural contexts have shifted multiple times around it, that the world depicted in the early episodes is separated from the present by a gap of more than a quarter century. The show that premiered in 1999 exists now as a period piece in some of its early episodes, a window into a specific moment of American culture that has been preserved in animation and is still being broadcast alongside new episodes made in the present. There's something almost archaeological about that, the old and the new sitting side by side, separated by decades of cultural change but unified by the continuing presence of the same voices, the same characters, the same fictional town on the coast of a state that several of the people who created the show once called home. Section 11, Part 2. The numbers, the streaming age, and why Family Guy keeps going. Let us talk about what happens to a show's audience over a very long run, because the story of Family Guy's ratings is one of the most dramatic and well-documented examples of audience erosion in the history of broadcast television. And the way it played out tells you something important about how the entertainment landscape changed around the show while it was still in production. At its peak, in the years immediately following the 2005 revival, Family Guy regularly attracted between 8 and 10 million viewers per episode on its Sunday night broadcast. Those were strong numbers, not Simpsons at its height numbers, not the extraordinary figures from the Super Bowl premiere, but respectable, commercially significant ratings that kept advertisers happy and the network willing to fund continued production. The decline was gradual at first. One season's average would be slightly below the previous seasons. The demographic numbers, the ratings in the 18 to 49 age range that advertisers specifically pay premiums to reach, would tick down incrementally. The movement was slow enough that in any given year it could be attributed to factors outside the show's control. Competition from other programs, the general decline in broadcast television viewership as streaming alternatives multiplied, the fragmentation of the entertainment landscape that was distributing audiences across a much wider range of options. All of those factors were real. Broadcast television viewership was declining across the board throughout the 2000s, and Family Guy was not uniquely vulnerable to those trends. The Simpsons, which had been on the air since 1989, was also seeing its broadcast numbers fall. Every show on every network was dealing with the reality that the audience for first-run broadcast television was shrinking, as Netflix and Hulu and Amazon and an increasing number of other streaming services offered compelling alternatives. But the degree to which Family Guy's numbers fell was more extreme than the general broadcast decline would predict. By the time the show reached season 20, it was averaging approximately 1.31 million viewers per episode. Season 23, which aired during the 2021 to 2022 broadcast season, averaged approximately 723,000 viewers. To put that in context, when the show premiered in 1999, over 22 million people watched the first episode. By season 23, fewer than 750,000 were watching new episodes. The show had lost, across the span of its run, roughly 97% of its premiere audience. Even accounting for the artificial inflation of the Super Bowl premiere, and even accounting for the general decline in broadcast viewership, those numbers represented a specific and significant loss of the audience that had been built through the revival years. And yet, and this is the genuinely interesting part of the story, the show kept going. It was renewed, multiple times, for multiple additional seasons. The most recent renewal, announced in April of 2025, extends production through season 27 and the 2028 to 2029 television season. How does a show that draws 723,000 viewers get renewed for 4 more seasons? The answer involves a fairly detailed understanding of how the economics of long-running animated television actually work. and it is a story that Family Guy is not alone in. The Simpsons, which has also seen its broadcast ratings decline substantially from its peak, has continued to be renewed past the point where its first-run broadcast numbers would seem to justify it. The key is that broadcast ratings represent only one, and increasingly not the most important, revenue stream for a long-running animated show. The others include, but are not limited to, streaming residuals from Hulu and other platforms where the show's back catalog is available. International licensing fees from the countries around the world where the show airs. Merchandise revenue from the branded products, clothing, toys, collectibles, games, home goods. That Family Guy's character design support. Syndication payments from the cable networks that air reruns, and the general value of maintaining a recognizable intellectual property that can be extended into new formats and platforms. Family Guy has been in production long enough that its back catalog, the more than 400 episodes that have been produced over 20-plus seasons, represents an enormous asset that generates revenue independently of the first-run broadcast performance. An episode that attracted 8 million viewers when it first aired in 2006 continues to generate revenue every time it is streamed on Hulu, every time it airs in syndication on Adult Swim or FXX, every time someone in another country watches it on whatever platform carries it there. Across hundreds of episodes, those streams add up to figures that are large enough to justify the relatively modest per-episode cost of producing a new season. Animation is, compared to live-action television, cheap to produce. There are no expensive sets to build and maintain. There are no union crews of hundreds managing lighting and camera equipment. The voice actors record their lines in booths, one at a time or in small groups. The animation is produced overseas, in studios in South Korea and elsewhere where labor costs are lower than in Los Angeles. The per-episode production cost for Family Guy, while certainly not trivial, is substantially lower than the per-episode cost of most live-action dramas and comedies of comparable running time. This combination, modest production costs, substantial ongoing revenue from back catalog, and the brand value of a globally recognized property, creates the economic logic for continuing to produce new episodes, even when the first-run broadcast numbers are a fraction of what they were. The new episodes serve partly as a creative endeavor and partly as marketing for the back catalog. They keep the brand alive, generate press coverage, give the streaming platforms fresh content to promote, alongside the years of older content, and demonstrate to the audience that Family Guy is still a current, active property rather than a historical artifact. This logic will presumably continue to operate for as long as the economics remain favorable, which, given the scale of the existing catalog and the global appetite for the Family Guy brand in merchandise and licensing, could be a very long time. The decision to renew through Season 27 was not made because of what the Season 23 rating suggested about the show's creative vitality. It was made because the spreadsheet that calculates the show's total economic value across all revenue streams continues to produce a number that justifies the investment. There is something both pragmatic and slightly melancholy about this. The show that exists today, watched by hundreds of thousands of people on Wednesday nights on Fox, is simultaneously a minor presence in the current television landscape and a major asset in the portfolio of entertainment properties that Disney, which now owns the former 21st Century Fox Entertainment assets, manages globally. Those two things coexist, and neither cancels the other out. It is just the particular shape that a show takes when it has been running for a very long time. Seth MacFarlane described this as escape velocity, the point at which a show has been running long enough that the logic of continuation becomes self-sustaining, independent of the usual creative and commercial calculations that govern whether a newer show would be renewed or canceled. Once you have 400 episodes, a global merchandise line, streaming deals in dozens of countries, and a character library that has been in continuous cultural circulation for 25 years, you have something that functions more like a franchise than a television show in the traditional sense. Franchises don't get canceled the way shows get canceled. They evolve, expand, contract, change platforms, but they continue. Family Guy is a franchise now. Whether it is a television show in the fullest sense of that term, a piece of creative work made by people with something to say, shaped by genuine artistic intent, produced with the energy of people who believe in what they're making, is a more complicated question, and one that different observers would answer differently depending on which episodes they've been watching most recently. Both things are true. The franchise will continue. Whether the show, in the deepest sense of that word, is still fully alive is a question that only the people in the writer's room and the man in the recording booth can really answer. Section 12. The Legacy. What Family Guy really left behind. There is a question that hangs over every show that runs long enough to outlive its cultural peak. What does it mean? Not in the cosmic sense, but in the more grounded, practical sense of artistic and cultural legacy. What did this show actually contribute? What did it change? What would be different if it had never existed? Or if it had ended sooner? Or if it had been made by someone else? Or if Fox had kept it canceled in 2002 instead of letting it come back? The answers are not simple, and they are not uniformly flattering to the show. But they are honest. And honesty is what a show that spent 25 years pushing against dishonesty in its comedy at least deserves in its retrospective. Family Guy changed the grammar of American television comedy in at least two significant ways, and both changes have permanent effects that are visible in the comedy landscape today. The first is the cutaway gag itself. Before Family Guy popularized and refined this format, and the show did not invent it, but it elevated it to an art form and made it central to a show's identity in a way nobody had before. The dominant modes of television comedy were either linear narrative, the sitcom with its clear A-plot and B-plot structure, or sketch, the variety show with distinct unrelated segments. Family Guy's innovation was to embed something like sketch comedy inside a narrative format, to create the feeling of watching a story while constantly departing from it, to train an audience to find the interruptions themselves as satisfying as the main event. This format has been borrowed, adapted, and refined by many shows since. The influence on animated comedy specifically has been enormous. Shows that use non-sequential joke structures that make the comedy of interruption a formal element of their narrative design are working in a tradition that Family Guy did more than any other show to establish. Whether this is entirely a good legacy is debatable. The cutaway's weaknesses are as available for borrowing as its strengths, but it is undeniably a real one. The second contribution is less often discussed but equally significant. Family Guy proved that a canceled show could come back, and that it could come back because of audience loyalty expressed through channels other than traditional broadcast ratings. The show's revival in 2005, driven by DVD sales and cable rerun performance, was a demonstration that the relationship between a show and its audience was not exhausted by the first-run broadcast window, that an audience could maintain its connection to a canceled show, even grow it, and that this loyalty had commercial value that networks were capable of recognizing and acting on. This precedent did not immediately transform the television industry, but its influence was real. The years that followed the Family Guy revival saw an increasing willingness by networks and streaming platforms to consider revival projects, to look at canceled shows with passionate fan bases as commercial opportunities rather than lost causes. Arrested Development was revived on Netflix. Veronica Mars was revived on Hulu. Roseanne came back as The Conners. Community, after nearly dying multiple times, completed its journey to a film. The calculation that drives all of these decisions, that an audience that has demonstrated loyalty through non-traditional channels constitutes a valuable commercial asset, is a calculation that Family Guy's revival helped make legible to the industry. On the cultural side, Family Guy's influence on American comedy is harder to measure but no less real. The show introduced to primetime television a form of comedy that was deliberately offensive in ways that earlier primetime shows had carefully avoided. Not just edgy, but genuinely willing to make jokes that would offend specific audiences, that named specific groups, that engaged with specific political and cultural realities, with a directness that The Simpsons had always approached more obliquely. This willingness opened a door that other shows walked through, sometimes in productive directions and sometimes in destructive ones. The show also, through Seth MacFarlane's musical sensibility, kept alive a tradition of theatrical musical comedy in animated television that might otherwise have faded entirely. The elaborate musical numbers that Family Guy has produced over its run, the Broadway parodies, the standards performed straight, the genuinely affecting songs that appear without warning in the middle of an episode, represent a kind of creative investment that the show's commercial reputation sometimes obscures. Seth MacFarlane is a real musician, a real singer, a genuine devotee of the Great American Songbook and its theatrical traditions. Family Guy, at its best, was a vehicle for that devotion, and the musical moments it produced are among its most durable achievements. The show's legacy is also inseparable from its failures, which are documented and significant. The treatment of Meg Griffin over roughly 10 seasons is a chapter in the show's history that does not reflect well on the production or the institution that enabled it. The gradual erosion of character depth in the show's central figures, the Flanderization of Peter, the decline of Brian, the retreat of Stewie from his original dangerous originality, represents a specific and preventable artistic failure that the show's commercial success made it possible to ignore. The increasing reliance on shock value over genuine wit in the later seasons produced, at its worst, television that was neither funny nor interesting, nor even successfully provocative, just loud. These failures matter as part of the legacy, not because they cancel the achievements, but because they illustrate a recurring truth about creative institutions. The same qualities that drive success can, if left unchecked, eventually drive decline. Family Guy's anarchic energy, which was its greatest strength in the early seasons, became, without the curatorial presence of its creator and the discipline of a writer's room committed to quality over output, a form of creative entropy. The energy remained, but it lost the direction that had made it productive. Seth MacFarlane at 24, pitching 7 minutes of animation to a conference room of Fox executives, had something that Seth MacFarlane at 50 cannot quite recover. The experience of making something for the first time from nothing, with everything to prove and nothing to protect. That specific energy is not sustainable. It burns itself out in the making. What replaces it, ideally, is craft and experience, and the hard-won knowledge of how to construct something that works. Sometimes that transition produces art that is better than the original burst of inspiration. Sometimes it produces something that is technically accomplished, but lacks the heat that made the original worth caring about. Family Guy's trajectory sits somewhere between those two outcomes. The show at its best, the early seasons, specific standout episodes scattered through the revival years, the Brian and Stewie episode, the best of the Road to Adventures, is genuinely excellent television comedy. The show at its worst is something you could leave on out in the background without paying attention, and not miss anything that matters. The distance between those two versions of the same show is the distance that the legacy needs to hold both of simultaneously. What Seth MacFarlane made, starting with a thesis film at RISD and a development deal from a network that would cancel him twice, is something that has been part of the American cultural landscape for more than a quarter century. The characters, Peter's beer-soaked grandiosity, Lois's patient endurance, Stewie's baroque scheming, Brian's thwarted intellectualism, Meg's bruised dignity, have entered the cultural vocabulary in ways that outlast individual episodes or seasons. People who have never watched a complete episode of Family Guy know who Peter Griffin is. They can hear Seth MacFarlane's voice doing the character and identify it immediately. That kind of cultural penetration is not nothing. It is, in fact, extraordinary. The show that began as a canceled curiosity was resurrected by the loyalty of an audience that found it through channels nobody had predicted, survived a creator's growing disengagement and a network's commercial logic and its own creative stumbles, and is still, as of this narration, producing new episodes. That show's legacy is still being written. The final chapter of Family Guy has not aired yet. What we know so far is this: a man from Connecticut who loved to draw, who got a job animating cartoons, who pitched a 7-minute film to a television network and was given the money and the platform to make it into something real, built a show that changed television in ways that are measurable and ways that are not. That the show's best days may be behind it does not diminish what those days were. That the show's creator has moved on emotionally while remaining contractually tethered to his creation is a kind of bittersweet truth that anyone who has ever made something and then grown beyond it will recognize. There is a version of this story that ends cleanly, with a final season that brings the characters to some kind of resolution, that honors what they were at their best, that gives Seth MacFarlane and the cast and the audience a proper goodbye. Whether that version of the story gets told depends on decisions that haven't been made yet, about a show that is still in production by people who are still figuring out what they want it to be. It, For now, let it rest in the space that long-running things tend to occupy in our collective memory. Not quite past, not quite present, still alive in some rooms and in some screens, still voiced by some of the same people who first brought it to life more than 25 years ago. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. And from a small apartment in Rhode Island with a fuzzy door that a 20-something animator thought was funny enough to name his production company after it all began. If this helped you drift off, or if it kept you comfortably company through a quiet night, I'm genuinely glad. This community means everything to us here at Uncle Guy Lore. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. We love knowing who's out there in the dark with us. If you haven't already, a subscription would mean more than you know. We have more of these waiting for you. More long-form stories, more behind-the-scenes histories, more of the deep dives that are best experienced at the end of the day when everything goes quiet. Until next time, sleep well. A final word, the show that refused to stay dead. There is a specific kind of stubbornness that runs through the entire history of Family Guy. Not the stubbornness of ego or of commercial calculation, though both of those have played their role, but something closer to the stubbornness of a thing that has decided, against all reasonable evidence, that it is going to exist. That it is going to keep existing. That cancellations and scheduling problems and critical dismissals and creator disengagement and ratings declines and network tensions are all, in the end, temporary. And that the show itself is, in some sense, that defies ordinary logic, permanent. There is no rational explanation for why Family Guy is still in production in the late 2020s. Any individual factor that has accumulated around the show, 2 cancellations, a 3-year hiatus, the departure of much of its original creative team, a creator who has publicly expressed ambivalence about the network that airs it, ratings that represent a tiny fraction of what they once were, would, applied to a different show, produce an outcome that ends with the show not being made anymore. The fact that none of those factors, individually or in combination, has managed to stop Family Guy from being made says something about the particular stubbornness of things that have already proven they can survive. Seth MacFarlane survived the chaotic first 3 seasons. The show survived 2 cancellations. The audience survived 3 years of the show not existing and came back bigger than before. The characters survived being fundamentally altered from who they were at the beginning, diminished in some ways, but still recognizable, still voiced by the same people who brought them to life, still capable in their best moments of producing something that makes you laugh out loud or feel unexpectedly moved. The show's fans, the most loyal of whom have been watching since 1999, have survived watching a show they love become, in the middle of its run, a show they sometimes found difficult to love, and then watching it gradually, imperfectly, become somewhat more like itself again. Fan communities are patient things, usually. They hold the memory of a show's best self and measure each new episode against it, wincing at the misses and genuinely celebrating the hits, continuing to care even when caring is frustrating. What Family Guy leaves behind in the cultural record, what it leaves for the people who will study American television in the coming decades, who will write dissertations and critical essays and pop history books about this particular era, is a complicated and rich archive, more than 400 episodes of varying quality, from the genuinely brilliant to the genuinely embarrassing. A musical legacy that is more substantial than the show's reputation suggests. A formal innovation, the cutaway gag as a primary comedic unit, that permanently changed how animated television comedy is constructed. A demonstration that canceled shows can be resurrected, that audience loyalty has commercial value across multiple decades and multiple distribution formats, that the relationship between a show and its viewers can survive conditions that would end most relationships. And at the center of it, the characters. Peter Griffin, who has been one of the most visible people in American comedy for over 25 years. Brian Griffin, the literary dog whose decline from lovable intellectual to insufferable hypocrite was both a creative failure and a sustained character study in the specific ways that intelligence without integrity corrodes itself. Stewie Griffin, the evil genius baby who became, against all original intentions, the show's most emotionally expressive character and one of its most genuinely beloved. Lois Griffin, the patient center of a family that tested patience in ways no real person would endure. Meg Griffin, who was treated worst and felt everything most. These are fictional people. They don't exist. They live in animation files and voice recordings and the memories of the people who watched them grow up, or in the show's case, conspicuously fail to grow up, over more than 2 decades. But they have occupied enough space in enough people's inner lives that the distinction between fictional and real begins to feel less important than it usually does. The story of Family Guy is the story of what happens when something survives long enough to become larger than the intentions behind it. Seth MacFarlane made a show. The show outlasted his period of maximum creative engagement with it. The show became a franchise. The franchise continues. Somewhere inside the franchise, in the best episodes of any given season, the show still occasionally becomes what it was at its best: funny, surprising, alive. That's the thing about stubbornness. It keeps you in the room, even when the room has changed. And being in the room is how you get the moments that make it worthwhile. One last thing before sleep claims you completely. The apartment door in Rhode Island was fuzzy. The name on Seth MacFarlane's production company, the name in the credits of every Family Guy episode that has ever aired, is a memorial to a texture. To the specific feel of a door in a college apartment in a small school in New England, where a young man was learning how to make the thing he had always wanted to make. He made it. Against remarkable odds, he made it, and it is still being made. The fuzzy door is still there in the credits. Isn't that something? Sleep well.